Chapter 121. Chapter 95 The Real Death. Standing in the fourth layer of the spirit realm, Cronus recalled the previous conversation and was once again astonished by the ancient god's boundless imagination. Prophecy could not achieve this, that much was certain. Cronus, as he existed now, was not the same as he had been thousands of years ago. He had developed his own understanding of the present world, of fate and of all things. He clearly knew what prophecies could and could not do. But from another perspective, he realized that Laine had never relied on so-called prophecy to see his destiny. Instead, he had used some other method. However, this only added another layer of mystery to him. The unknown is always more terrifying than the known. If I hadn't seen it here, I wouldn't have known that while we were fighting tooth and nail, you still had time to busy yourself with what? Art. Perhaps to you, my father's actions seemed like a performance, especially designed to amuse you. Looking at the ignited scroll on the ground, Cronus said self-mockingly. Previously, it was in such flames that he was burned of the part that floated on the surface, then watched as Laine adorned himself with that part. Now, what remained before him was just a special incarnation. Very lifelike. If it weren't me in the painting, perhaps I would even consider collecting it. He made an appropriate comment. Though the scroll was burning on the ground, the contents were still clearly visible. Heavenly Father Uranus was pierced through the chest, yet his expression was gentle and affectionate. He seemed to be whispering softly, like a loving father imparting wisdom to his children. Opposite him, he himself held a sickle, his face a mix of shock and anger, and the titans had various expressions. At the bottom of the painting, the fissures in the earth were like a human face, symbolizing Mother Earth who had always been in opposition to the sky. This scroll recorded the fall of the first divine king, and now, it was the fire ignited by it that cremated the second divine king. Regardless of what he himself was, divine King Cronus had already died. This power must be death. With the death of a divine king, can it now support someone with intermediate divine power? After all, he had only died halfway, so the concept of death's ascension had not yet reached its end. Feeling that power, Cronus seemed to envision the end of all spirits. Of course, this did not include the gods. It could not affect the undying root of a true god. But at that moment, he recalled the only mistake in his life. Creatures he called demigods could probably be erased from existence effortlessly. Indeed, the world of chaos is terrifyingly distorted in some ways, like life and death. Nodding in agreement, Laine reached out and drew forth a black power. It was the death previously absorbed by the spirit realm, which he cast into the flames on the ground. The fire flickered and then burned more fiercely. "Let's begin," he said. "I've got what I wanted, you have the hope of rebirth, and then we'll embark on the greatest adventure of this era together. An incarnation also counts as an adventure." He replied indifferently, and Cronus stepped forward at a leisurely pace. "An incarnation containing a part of my essence counts indeed. If I were trapped within, I too would have quite the headache," he answered offhandedly, as the power of the spirit realm was gathered, intensifying around the black fire in front of him. In Laine's presence, the former king of time and space entered the flames of death. The transformation that had begun halfway was now continuing. Even with unmatched power in the spirit realm, Laine could not coerce an undying true god if the other did not will it. Such was the rule established at the birth of chaos. But when the other party voluntarily cooperated, under the aegis of great divine power, tiny, marvelous things began to peel off from Cronus. It was his past, his being, his godhood, and also the world of chaos, the gifts from Heavenly Father and Mother Earth to his identity as Cronus. With each peel, the presence of the former divine king diminished, and the burning black fire grew more intense. Death is weak because in chaos, gods do not die. But as a true immortal slowly stepped into death, the strength it embodied also continued to rise. From his feet to his knees, then spreading to his waist, neck, and over his head. The black fire of the death of the divine king grew fiercer, enveloping Cronus completely. Until a moment arrived when, as if the fuel was extinguished, all the black fire gradually died out. What remained in its place was only a black multifaceted crystal. In the preceding process, the origin of time and space had merged into the world, making the seven planes more stable. At the core of the spirit realm, a mirror that had long taken shape suddenly surged in power by several notches. Beside it, the origin of time trembled once or twice but did not coalesce into one. Just as Laine had underestimated the primordial gods before, he also underestimated the complete Genesis artifact. The sacred artifact belonging to time still needed an opportunity to be born. Of course, from another point of view, When he mentioned that the artifact symbolizing time needed a couple of eras to develop at the end of the last era, it was quite apt. Tap. On the other side, the power drained, the somewhat blurred scroll fell to the ground after the black fire went out. Its material had been changed, having undergone fate and recursion, its symbolism in certain aspects was enhanced. But after the previous burning, it no longer possessed the might of a divine artifact. Chapter 122. Chapter 95 The Real Death _2. But when Laine created it, it was specifically for today. Having witnessed the end of the last divine king by his hand, he naturally could also bring about his own end. If it weren't for this special symbol of destiny, relying solely on the frail death to achieve all this would have indeed been difficult. Compared to before, you now seem more like the true hidden. Because your very existence has already been forgotten by all things. At this moment, in the fourth layer of the spirit realm, it seemed as though the previous divine king had been burned to death. However, in Laine's view, Cronus was still there. Only now, what constituted him was merely the immortal source as a deity. That was an essence Laine still couldn't understand to this day, originating from chaos itself, stronger than even great divine power. In terms of his previous life, such a supreme essence both existed and did not exist. It was neither pure nor impure, neither born nor annihilated, neither increasing nor decreasing. Congratulations, you have completed the first step of being reborn anew. Stepping forward, he picked up the scroll covered in scorch marks and unfolded it. In the dim light, the figure of Cronus within the painting became somewhat indistinct and unreal. He then threw in what did not involve power, the existence that belonged to the identity of Cronus, back into the figure in the painting to replenish it, and then casually tossed the scroll to the side. But in the fourth layer of the spirit realm, where time and space were still chaotic and disordered, only the area around Laine and the cocoon of light formed with the three gods was governed by order. Thus, in the chaotic time and space of the spirit realm, this powerless painting was just a flicker before its whereabouts became unknown. When shall we depart? No voice came through, but Laine heard Cronus's words. Now, only beings close to great divine power could notice the former divine king who had lost everything. Laine could sense the other's urgency, like a customer who has paid in full, and even though they know it's unlikely for the other party to breach the contract, they still feel somewhat uneasy. This had nothing to do with identity or state of mind. After all, what he had given was everything. Don't rush, I still have some things to prepare. With a sweep of his hand, in an instant, the power of the spirit realm enveloped most places of Chaos's current world. With a subtle connection to the spiritual bodies, Laine directly locked onto his target. So many years had passed, and aside from a few dangerous places, such as around the primordial gods or the edges of the oceans, the ends of the starry sky, the surface layer of the spirit realm had already covered almost everywhere. Therefore, under the influence of the Lord of the spirit realm, an invisible power spread out. All the souls of the deceased silver humanity were gathered into a sphere of light that fell into Laine's palm, with only the few humans who survived the battle of the gods escaping this fate. But this might not necessarily be a good thing. After all, being taken away by Laine might not mean a bad end, but those humans left behind on Earth will surely be accounted for by the new king. Some souls can be used to give you a preview, to test the viability of my idea. If it ends up successful, I might as well leave these sinful souls to you. It seems you can make them bow and scrape to you, right? With a slight smile, he had no intention of using the power of the spirit realm to dissolve and absorb the souls of the golden and silver generations of humans. As he said before, merely harvesting souls as seeds was too crude. A continuous cycle was the right way. But given that the first two generations of humans could not reproduce, the matter of cycling would fall upon their successors. Of course, I will ensure that some common souls stay in line. With a hint of ill intent, although these humans had no direct grievances with him, who asked them to be the symbols of enmity between Mother Earth and himself. Besides, the sinfulness of their souls was as visible as daylight in the special environment of the spirit realm. Cronus assured that no matter how naturally rebellious these fellows were, he had plenty of methods to teach them what obedience meant. Then let's set off. I have to say, I'm somewhat looking forward to it. If it weren't for the fact that as the sovereign of spirituality, the consciousness within me is unified, I wouldn't dare go with you. Taking a sprinkle of well of origin water in hand, Laine stepped out and, together with the intangible Cronus, vanished from the fourth layer of the spirit realm. And so this layer of the spirit realm quieted down once again, only the three god-bearing cocoons and death, whose power had reached the strength of great divine power, continued to sway slowly in the void. At the same time, Laine was collecting the souls of silver humanity. In the realm of Lightless, the Lord of Darkness, Erebus, who stood at the boundary, had a slight change in expression. Raising his right foot, he was almost ready to step out. The entire realm of Lightless trembled with his movement, and the underworld would part before the primordial gods if he so wished, and he would personally test the depths of that divine king. But in the next instant, Erebus halted his step. He realized that the part of his power left within the souls of silver humanity had not been disturbed. They were still in the souls, undetected by anyone, nor had they come into contact with the origin of the spirit realm. There's no need to rush. I've waited through tens of thousands of years. What's a little while longer? Let him perform more futile efforts for now. What significance is there in flaunting power before the weak? His eyes flickered for a moment before returning to normal. He continued to watch the unfolding events. Erebus could tell that the confrontation with the gods was a facade. In reality, the figure was testing the tolerance of the present world's rules in some form. Chapter 123, Chapter 95 The Real Death _3. But this didn't hinder the Dark Overlord from uttering a sneer in the shadows, for he knew that soon the other would come to realize that the rigid world of the present doesn't entertain anything like tolerance. Or rather, its level of tolerance was absolutely zero. His own sister still failed to understand this principle, even though Gaia herself was one of the keystones that formed the foundation of the present world, and yet, as she walked the earth with her half-majestic identity, she was continually greeted by relentless division and weakening. Even without seeing the trajectory of fate, Erebus could guess that before Gaia was completely shattered and her divine powers dissipated, or before she returned to her original form, this weakening wouldn't cease. If my dear sister experiences this, then what about you? Of course, you're not under its control, so it can't directly influence you, but it can reject you, just as it has rejected me. With a light chuckle, the Dark Overlord knew that the wonders of divine authority did not end there. Otherwise, he would not have previously extolled them so highly. But the effects were more directed towards the spirit realm rather than any individual entity. But as Erebus didn't have a world of his own yet, he didn't much envy this effect. Continuing to stand on the edge of the realm, feeling that separated piece of darkness, Erebus patiently waited. Until he sensed them appearing in a place that was both familiar and strange to him, not far from where he was. Tartarus. I too am quite curious about what exactly resides within my oblivious brother. Let me see what you're up to. His brow slightly furrowed. The part of the soul led into the abyss was undoubtedly beyond the Dark Overlord's expectations. Within it, although he could still feel his power, it was more passive. He could still know what they had experienced, but it was likely to be after the event occurs, and there might be a slight delay. But how the souls of silver humanity were handled was never in his control to begin with. So Erebus had no additional reaction. He simply stood with his hands behind his back, silently waiting. Meanwhile, upon the earth, the power of the Divine King was the manifestation of the blessing of the present world. Others might not notice the issue, but the world itself was not easily deceived. On Cronus, each and every second, such power was continually slipping away. Even if he did nothing, it would last at most 7 days. Therefore, to ensure the divine power that was fast depleting in its intertwining with the current order of the world might persist a little longer, Cronus had a thought and lifted a distant seal. Suddenly, the power maintaining the seal returned, and the atmosphere around him instantly stabilized. Pleased and nodding in approval, Cronus glanced in front of him. His right hand exerted a gentle force, and the gods, who were still struggling, were immediately pressed inch by inch to the ground. The thunder and the deluge, transformed from divine power, clashed against the colossal hand, yet could not shake it in the slightest. Gaia, truly an old friend. Looking up, towards the east of the vast land, a yellow light illuminated the sky, a sign that Mother Earth was on her way. Compared to Zeus, who was far from his peak, this primordial god, who hadn't yet declined to her extreme, was a worthy opponent to be confronted. Now, this is getting interesting. The current Zeus is just so-so. To make the present world feel the threat from the gods, he alone is not enough. With a snort, Cronus blurred for a moment. The next instant, as the power of space and time surged, a phantasmal figure connecting heaven and earth soared into being. With his head touching the sky and his feet on the ground, Mount of the Gods was but weeds by his legs, and the rivers and mountains were merely ants before him. Adjusting to the new perspective, The colossal phantasmal presence moved, confronting Gaia from afar. "Who are you?" Watching this scene, Gaia gritted her teeth, confirming her suspicion. Cronus had been replaced, and through the Earth's sensing, nowhere else could she find the presence of her youngest son. Laine or Erebus, only these two had the potential to commit such an act. At that moment, Gaia once again regretted why she had believed her brother's lies. Whatever meant for the spirit realm and silver humanity might just be as the prophecy had spoken, a poison aimed specifically at the Divine King. In front of her, however, Cronus didn't care about her thoughts. He merely bent slightly, and the clouds in the sea of clouds parted in succession. Looking towards his mother goddess, who was nominally himself, Cronus said indifferently, "Who am I? Do you not see clearly yet, Gaia? I am the Divine King, the supreme ruler of the sky, the earth, and the oceans. Of course, if you prefer to call me by my very first name, that's also fine." The colossal phantasmal figure looked up, beholding the starry direction above. It seemed that with the unsealing, something expected had changed there. But it was meaningless. In the past, the master of the sun was an adversary, but now, the sun itself was nothing but a toy. So, he looked towards Mother Earth, towards the gods, and towards all beings that should pledge loyalty to the Divine King. Since he was now the Divine King, he should say what a Divine King ought to say. "Sing praises to my name, my foolish subjects." Supreme power coalesced, accompanying his voice, spreading throughout the world. "I am Cronus, I am the king of time and space." The power that had reached its zenith swirled around the massive phantasm, like silvery white ribbons of light. The next moment, Cronus clenched his fists and hammered down fiercely towards the earth. Without any flourish, this was the collision between status and power. A vast and endless halo of earthy yellow light staunchly blocked his path. Facing this world-shaking strike, Gaia merged with the earth, and the authority of the primordial gods was undeniable. The world seemed to fall silent for an instant, as two powers beyond mighty divine powers clashed. The void began to crumble, and the shockwaves drove the gods back. Gaia was slightly inferior, and therefore at the point of her position, the earth sunk in, forming a massive basin. Countless mountain gods and river gods turned to dust in an instant, but it was not over yet. Under the horrified gazes of the gods, the phantasm that had just caused all of this took a step back due to the rebounding force, and collided thunderously with the towering mount of the gods. The next moment, Mount Otherworld, the tallest mountain in the world, closest to the sky, began to tremble violently and then slowly collapsed towards the northwest. Chapter 124, Chapter 96 Tartarus. Time had reverted to not long before. The collision on the earth had just begun, Mother Earth had not yet arrived, and the mount of the gods remained unscathed, while the sky and the earth had not yet started to quake. But in the underworld, Laine's avatar, carrying the items prepared in advance, stepped out of the spirit realm along with the essence left by Cronus. In fact, half a day earlier, when the flames of the death of the Divine King had burned away what belonged to divine authority from Cronus, the transition between epochs had already begun. As for the later burning of the remaining parts of the former Divine King, it had little to do with the epic transition. It was merely a personal affair of Cronus, the god of time and space. To use the past to combat the present, to use a Divine King to combat another, that was where the value of the death of the Divine King lay, not just as a mere scroll of a divine artifact. If Laine simply wanted a few artifact-level paintings, he could have easily created several, but only this masterpiece, born at the turn of an era and imbued with special content, possessed the same special symbolism. With its help, the power of the Divine King was stripped away and transferred to Laine's true self. However, even though he had deceived the law as much as possible, this power was still difficult to retain in his external body for long. Of course, Laine did not need it to last too long. The time he had was already enough to finish what he wanted to do. Probing the rules of the modern world, increasing the restrictions on the powers of the gods of the next era, and granting the spirit realm legitimate, world-facing rights. These tasks, difficult to achieve as Lord of the Spirit Realm, could easily be accomplished under the auspices of the Divine King. By comparison, things like endorsing the magic net's establishment in the modern world were minor details. After all, even without the authority of the Divine King, it was highly probable that the modern world's rules would not reject the magic net. Organizing energy, clarifying chaos, these were the very activities favored by the modern world. If it weren't for the source of the magic net originating from the spirit realm, and that over the past thousands of years, it had gradually blended with the power of the spirit realm, It's likely that Hecate could have received the same commendation from the law as Themis once did. Of course, she probably wouldn't have that chance now. Besides, aside from the serious matters, Laine also wanted to take this opportunity to experience the pleasure of suppressing the gods with force. Otherwise, he could have completed all this secretly, rather than confront the gods with his power alone, as he was doing now. In truth, every intellectually active person has, deep down, entertained the notion of solving all problems with force. In the midst of a whirlwind of thoughts, Laine did not linger any longer. The true self had its tasks, and the avatar had its own mission. In an instant, he and Cronus appeared in a familiar place. The boundary between the underworld and the abyss, the portal between the modern world and the realm beyond. The chaotic rules were evident here. With up and down inverted, left and right switched, everything seemed incomprehensible. This was the most terrifying interface among the realms beyond the world, a collection left over from the creation of the world, the source of all chaos, the bottomless abyss, Tartarus. Laine had only recently witnessed Zeus and his two brothers entering and exiting this place, and Cronus also had some understanding of it. After all, as an eternal prison, even if it had not been used until now, the Divine King inevitably wanted to learn about it. Especially the curse from the Heavenly Father before his death, which had hinted that this was supposed to be his destined end. Your future new home, it doesn't look too bad, does it? He cracked a joke casually. Laine actually didn't mind the chaos of this place that much. Unlike the deities of the modern world, the spirit realm was inherently a place where chaos and order coexisted. Even though Laine himself preferred the latter, he accepted the former as well. Thus, the spirit realm became increasingly chaotic from the outside going in, but the core, Mount Sinai, was the anchor that supported everything. If it were before, I definitely couldn't have accepted it. After all, my divine body and godhood were incompatible with this place. But now, with only my innate essence of immortality left, I actually don't feel any aversion to this place. Comparing his past and present feelings, Cronus had to admit that the modern world had an unceasing influence on the gods. Even though they themselves were unaware, godhood was subtly changing their thoughts. However, once stripped of everything bestowed by the modern world, this influence was also isolated. If chaos can be considered a whole, then the modern world was only its most significant part, not the entire entity. Therefore, standing here, the former Divine King felt no excessive sense of rejection. Since the dawn of the world, the will of chaos had been expressed in only 3 places. The first was the warning that resonated through the world when the spirit realm was created. The second was the birth of the immortal essence of the gods, and the last was speculated to have occurred at the very beginning of creation, before the primordial gods were born. Beyond that, divine phenomena like the creation of the Divine King's authority, and even the deity's godhood and divine bodies, were products below the order of the modern world. Outside the modern world, like Laine's spirit realm, though the symbol of authority, the multifaceted crystal, is also called godhood, in strict terms, it's not a structure, so sometimes, its own creator refers to it as deity. Let's go. Don't waste time. The epic transition is just a moment. Laughing, Laine took the lead into the boundary between the abyss and the underworld. If you're concerned about the lack of time, couldn't you have fought a bit longer above? Chapter 125. Chapter 96 Tartarus _2. He said as much, but Cronus followed closely behind. Although he too wished for his rebellious son to take a few more beatings, he was acutely aware that the divine battle playing out on Earth, and the skirmishes among the gods, were but a facade. What lay hidden behind it was the question of what kind of retribution would befall when half of a great deity's might was unleashed upon the world. Mother Earth herself was a part of the creation of the present world, and considering that she seldom directly displayed her power, the impact on her was more like being slowly sliced by a blunt knife. However, whether or not the actions of other beings would provoke a more direct response was the focal point of this test. Currently, with the lingering divine authority serving as a shield, all consequences from the test could be covered by it. The faster it faded, the more intense the reaction from the present world. And when that power completely vanished, Laine's true body would have to leave. After all, there was no being in chaos that could stand against the present world just yet. A distortion in space-time ensued, and in the next moment, Laine and Cronus arrived in this strange world one after the other. Stepping through this gateway, their connection to the underworld was severed. Even if they retraced their steps, they could no longer return to where they had come from. Currently, Laine could still rely on the link between his avatar and the spirit realm to find the right path, much as Zeus relied on the faint power of the divine king to travel back and forth from the Titan's prison. But once deeper inside, whether that connection could be maintained was uncertain. However, while the connection might be broken, the synchronicity of thought would not. Not even Tartarus could block the sovereign of spirits' execution of his authority. Let's go deeper in. The outer forces here are too weak. If we choose this place for the transformation, it might take thousands of years to complete, Laine said after surveying the surroundings. The power here is indeed somewhat thin. But within Tartarus, how do you distinguish inside from outside? Cronus asked, somewhat baffled, given that he had been here before. There was a gap between the Cronus of the past and Laine's true body, but not so much that he should be outdone by an avatar. If he couldn't perceive it, neither should the other. Do you remember the chaotic source force I took when Timus was legislating? Laine extended his hand, and a serpentine mist appeared in his palm. Cronus recognized it at a glance. It was the externalized form of the chaotic source force. I do have some understanding of chaos. One of the preparations I made for this trip was taking some of it to form the basis of this avatar. Hence, I might not notice subtle changes in the abyss, but I can still discern the broad strokes of strong and weak areas, Laine explained. After determining the direction, Laine led the way. Follow me. If we get separated, I'm not sure I'll be able to find you again. By that point, you'll have to rely on luck, he cautioned. Without a word, the former divine king dutifully followed Laine. Now, left only with his immortal essence, if he strayed from Laine's vicinity, he couldn't even affect his environment. Strictly speaking, his current state was just a step away from eternal slumber. It was only because of a previous agreement that the power of spirituality kept him conscious. In the abyss, they moved forward slowly. Their path twisted and turned, sometimes circular, without any logical sense to their actions. But as time ticked by, even with just a fraction of his essence remaining, Cronus could feel the surrounding aura becoming increasingly dense. However, as they ventured deeper, at a certain moment, Laine suddenly stopped. What's wrong? Though the aura indicated deep penetration into the bowels of Tartarus, Cronus was certain they were still far from the center. Nothing much, I've just noticed something strange. Laine furrowed his brow and gestured lightly through the chaos surrounding them. The next moment, the space fluctuated, and a mysterious, ever-changing rune appeared in his hand. At first glance, the rune resembled the one Laine had left in Delphi, with its shifting, uncertain feel of being both tangible and intangible. But upon closer inspection, one could sense a vast difference between the two. The rune Laine left behind not only had a much higher nature, approaching the origin of writing, but it also bridged the gap between order and chaos. Just by observing it, one could gain a wealth of conceptual knowledge. Even from the perspective of witchcraft, such a symbol, representing the Lord of the Spirit realm, could be used for meditation. But the rune in his hand was different. Perhaps because it originated in the abyss, Laine felt its sole purpose was to be meaningless. Of course, if one considered naming as meaning, then it did have one. However, since there were no other life forms or objects in Tartarus, this sole value of naming was also rendered worthless. Writing. There's something like that in the abyss too. Cronus couldn't help but express his surprise. The present world had innate divine writing. Laine had created the original spirit script, Metis had created hydrology, and there were also ordinary scripts taught to humans that lacked transcendent power, but those all presupposed a user. First there was the deity race, then came the innate divine writing. The Lord of the Spirit realm and spiritual life formed, and the original spirit script followed. It was only after the myriad Oceanides appeared that hydrology emerged. And without humans, ordinary scripts would not have been created. Chapter 126, Chapter 96 Tartarus_3. But the abyss was void of anything, devoid of any signs of life having ever existed. The only ones that had ever been there were the three titans who served as prisoners. Cronus truly couldn't fathom what meaning there could be in the birth of script here. It couldn't possibly be for the abyss itself to read, yet Tartarus was the only primordial god without personification, lacking the ability to see. Who knows? The abyss is one of the few places that even I know nothing about. Whatever happens here, I wouldn't be surprised. That's also why I describe this journey as an adventure, for I've even prepared for the possibility that the abyss might suddenly come to life. After studying the script in his hand for a while, Laine summoned a few more for comparison. But in the end, he still couldn't discern anything. Let's continue onward, hoping to find the answers inside. This journey into the abyss has truly been quite fruitful. Setting them aside, Laine decided not to dwell on it any longer. At the core of the abyss, he thought he would likely find the outcome. Even if the core held no answers, once Cronus completed his transformation, he might tell him the answer, if by that time his mind had not been confused by the powers of chaos. Okay. Nodding, Cronus also found this matter very interesting. After all, Laine's foundation was in the spirit realm. How the abyss was only due to a desire for exploration and prevention that he paid it attention. But for the former Divine King, it was necessary to understand every bit of the unknown here, so as not to unintentionally cause even greater troubles in the future. Discarding the script in his hands, the two set off once more. As they continued deeper, the surrounding void became darker, sometimes even taking on the color of chaos. Streaks of chaotic source force roamed around, and Laine tried to make contact with them but eventually gave up. These freely dissipating remnants of source power within the bowels of the abyss were difficult to utilize. They were the leftovers from the creation of the world, the detritus from the collapse of the chaotic void. If he took them out and tried to process them with the entire body of the spirit realm, it indeed could be done, but the point was trivial. On one hand, they were difficult to collect, and on another, it was too time-consuming. Laine could roughly judge that even if he spent 10,000 years, the power gained would likely be inconsequential. Even chaos itself, being larger than the spirit realm, chose to expel them into the body of Tartarus, letting them slowly erode over the long years. Rather than Laine spending his energy on them, it would be more valuable to think about how to improve the inner circulation of the spirit realm. As they delved deeper, the chaos tint and the currents laced with strands of source power became even denser. Under such circumstances, Laine also had to release his powers to resist the surrounding environment. In one moment, as they once again dodged a tidal wave formed by converging currents, Laine stopped in his tracks. Standing here, he could already see the core of the abyss. Laine's expression was a mixture of surprise and understanding, as all his previous doubts were answered, yet now he was unsure whether to feel disappointed or excited. What is it now? Having been impatient yet interrupted once more, Cronus showed a hint of impatience, but he still composed himself. Hesitating for a moment, Laine organized his thoughts. He was considering how to deal with the situation, but eventually, he began to speak slowly. Although this is the abyss, with the help of the chaotic source force that makes up this incarnation, I am still able to sense within a certain range, which I've mentioned before. Yes, so we're close now, you've already seen the core of Tartarus. With a relaxed expression, Cronus inquired. Yes, but I now have a piece of good news and a piece of bad news to tell you. Which do you want to hear first? His tone carried a hint of regret, but Laine did not intend to deceive the other party. After all, without Cronus, he himself would not be able to reap the benefits unless he gave up everything and accepted the abyss's transformation first, becoming one of its beings. But that was impossible. Straightforwardly, even if Cronus obtained it, he could still get a share of it. After all, this was not part of their previous agreement, and the other party also needed his help. Bad news. At his side, Cronus's expression became stiff. He had obviously misunderstood something. He had already gambled everything away, just as Laine once described him. The former Divine King had wagered it all, waiting for the moment to turn the tables. Now, any piece of bad news was something he did not wish to hear. Then let's hear the bad news first. The former Divine King took a deep breath and spoke. In any case, there was no room for regret for him now. No matter the outcome, he would have to accept it. The bad news is that our previous plan may no longer be viable. I had thought that there were no living beings in the abyss and that as long as you could make it here, by accepting the abyss's assimilation with a status devoid of all worldly endowments, intrinsic to that of a deity, then you could become its first god. You would be to the abyss what the primordial gods were to the world. But now, an outsider has taken your place there. Having lost the notion of being the first, even if we continue the plan, your gains would be much diminished. Observing more closely, Laine looked even more regretful. It was a pity that he was only an avatar entering now, but no one knew what was inside the abyss, and not being able to prepare beforehand was to be expected. As for having his true body come later for exploration, that would be pointless. Opportunity was fleeting, and it seemed that he would have to reluctantly become a shareholder, sharing in the dividends. What about the good news? After a prolonged silence, Cronus thought Laine felt sorry for him. He reluctantly accepted this outcome, as it seemed his luck had never been particularly good. Now, it was just another blow. Although he had lost the concept of being the first, he could still become an abyssal demon lord, it was just that the result was rather far from what he had envisioned. However, in front of him, Laine provided an answer that was beyond his expectations. The good news I have for you is. Shaking his head slightly, Laine looked at the former divine king beside him. It had to be said that perhaps fortune had turned, and this time, the other party might just pick up a bargain. Of course, along with the bargain, there also came a powerful enemy. I've opened up the spirit realm, you know that, right? Yes, so. What? So, have you ever considered opening one yourself, perhaps a smaller, weaker one, but a world that can grow and become strong without the influence of the current world? Chapter 127, Chapter 97 The Forgotten Goddess. In the heart of the abyss, Laine spoke in an even tone, yet his words stirred tempestuous waves in Cronus's heart. To create a world, in the previous era, no god knew what this meant, but now, there was not a single god who did not desire it. Even though most deities were unaware of the deeper secrets behind it, Laine, like a primordial god, lived in seclusion beyond the world, unaffected by two changes of divine kings, and even the twin gods of the Dark Night found him untouchable, a fact known to all. For the former divine king and the primordial gods, though, they saw something deeper. To effortlessly seal a true god, to step outside the framework of current-day laws, they might not have grasped the most fundamental secrets, but what was now revealed was enough to excite them. The complete will of chaos world rarely interfered with the gods, or rather, aside from the one time Laine created a world, no other god had ever felt its presence. However, the part of it that existed in this world was different, it constantly reminded the gods that, though they seemed immortal, a sword still hung above their heads. This was unbearable for them, and so the feeling of rebellion naturally emerged, along with an intensifying desire to create their own worlds. Cronus felt this especially strongly. Even without the authority of indeterminable destiny, once he created a world, the impact of fate on him would greatly diminish, and he was very clear about this fact. Just like the abyss, its connection to the current world was limited to a mutually connected passageway, and thus, throughout the ages, it had never undergone any changes due to fate. But because he understood this very clearly, Cronus found it somewhat unbelievable. Was Laine truly giving him an opportunity to stand on equal footing? If it were him, he would never allow a second god to possess such power. Don't misunderstand, Cronus, our worlds are probably somewhat different. Although I'm not very clear on the specifics, I can be sure that even if you succeed, your beginning would still be somewhat behind my spirit realm. Shaking his head gently, Laine saw through Cronus's thoughts. But just as he had considered, if it would cause significant trouble for himself, he would rather not do it. In fact, it was not just the start, but the upper limit of the new world that constituted the real difference between them. Years had passed, and Laine gradually discovered that the essence of the spirit realm's temporal nature was not the temporal source power of Cronus, but rather the faint temporal divinity he once possessed. At the time, he hadn't paid much heed to it, but now, Laine realized its strength. It was something left behind along with his spiritual body after enduring the baptism of the chaotic void. Even chaos had not been able to take it away. This was the foundation of the spirit realm, and that temporal source power was secondary. I'm not particularly concerned about that. Go on, tell me what you found. Of course he cared, but Cronus didn't expect to immediately create a world stronger than the spirit realm. Right now, he was more interested in what he was about to gain, and what he would have to give in return. Do you still remember Mnemosyne? Gazing into the distance, Laine felt somewhat sentimental. He hadn't expected such a twist. He had wondered which influence was behind the lack of the second wife for Zeus among those missing. He considered the twin gods of the Dark Night, Mother Earth, and even the Heavenly Father, who still hung in the sky, but he had never anticipated that it would be the unpersonal Abyss. After all, compared to the others, the power of the Abyss was stronger, and its isolation from destiny naturally more effective. Mnemosyne. Thousands of years ago, before the siege on the stars, I even mentioned her to Rhea. His expression changed slightly, and Cronus also remembered his sister. Not long after I had overthrown my father, due to the matters of the memory godhood, she harbored resentment towards you. Rumors said that she sought out Lady Night first but was turned away, and then she lingered at the gate of the Abyss for a long time, ultimately daring not to step inside. Later, it was said that she was taught a lesson by Atlas, the god of strength, who had not long been born, and then she vanished without a trace. Reflecting on the past, Cronus still remembered that at that time, Rhea had stood by his side without hesitation. Perhaps a goddess who loves her children is a good wife and a good mother, but she is not a good queen of gods. However, the former divine king didn't resent her. In any case, let the relationship between them be reduced to dust along with the death of Cronus. Thereafter, she was revered on the new Mount Olympus, while he became the new king in the bottomless abyss. So you're saying that Mnemosyne eventually made up her mind after that and entered into Tartarus? But didn't you say before that it's difficult to be transformed by the power of the abyss when one has both godhood and a divine body? That's why you asked me to cleanse myself of all past events. Detecting an issue, Cronus couldn't help but speak up and question. It is difficult, which is why it took her nearly 10,000 years and she still hasn't completed the process. This is all based on the premise that Mnemosyne only had weak divine power. Otherwise, even several epochs might not be enough to wash away the imprints of the current world on her. Faced with Cronus's interrogation, Laine explained patiently. I don't know how she entered, nor how she reached the core of the abyss, but there is no doubt that she is being transformed. Your sister willingly gave up her identity as a Titan goddess of the present world, choosing instead to become part of the abyss. Her godhood of language and innate script was stripped away over tens of thousands of years, and now she has almost completely become part of the abyss. When she awakens, she will be the first primordial deity born of the abyss. She will completely shed her former weakness, of course, and will also bear some responsibilities. Some responsibilities? Laine could guess what kind of obligations a goddess might have. I see. Then you might be in trouble. Having accepted Laine's explanation, Cronus couldn't help but turn and jest. She has always been unforgettable to you. Let her come. If she were a male deity, that would indeed be troublesome, for she would take the path I had originally envisaged for you. Regrettably, she is a goddess. Although I don't know why, even the chaotic abyss does not recognize a female deity to assume the highest authority. Not that he cared much, for Laine of the present no longer regarded any being without great divine power. In the future, there's a saying in the East, below the sage, all are ants, and Chaos World was much the same. Those who haven't reached this step are mere pawns. As for what this has to do with male and female deities, it goes back to the method Laine initially used to persuade Cronus. For the former divine king, if he couldn't continue to possess divine authority and power, he might as well sleep eternally like the Heavenly Father. Therefore, to borrow the divine authority of Cronus, and for the remnant temporal origin, as well as for the sake of the impending perfection, Laine also went to great lengths to consider for him. The so-called divine authority is not like godhood, but an additional authority granted by the laws of the current world. Thus, it rises and falls with the changes in the might of the divine king and grows stronger with events like legislation and creation of life under his rule, for it is indeed an embodiment of the world's favor. Chapter 128, Chapter 98, all three. Thus, having understood the nature of the divine king's power, Laine boldly made a prediction. In the present world that only possessed instinct devoid of wisdom, it would select those recognized by the gods, or those who had rendered meritorious deeds to become the divine king. But what about the abyss that lacked personification? Among the gods, the first-born primordial gods were the mightiest. So, in the abyss devoid of any trace of life, the divinity that first came into being would certainly not be inferior. Shedding everything from the past, stepping into the abyss in his purest form, embracing chaos and disorder, he would become the first deity of this place. Cronus would thus gain new power and, as the bringer of life and change to the abyss, would become the king of Tartarus, just like the Heavenly Father Uranus, not granted by man, but bestowed by heaven itself. It was under such words that Laine's plan ultimately swayed Cronus. Compared to the heavily constrained present world, becoming the first god and an eternal monarch of the abyss was not at all a worse choice. Therefore, under the joint witness of the spirit realm and the power of the divine king, the two parties reached this agreement, and thus today's events unfolded. Even today, Cronus still remembered those words Laine had said to him, which seemed to foretell destiny itself. 3 times you will gestate, 3 times you will be reborn. At the juncture where 2 eras transition, spanning 3 ages, you will once again come into this world. The abyss is the final destiny of your fate, just as the earth is the final destiny for you and your brothers. But once you cleanse the past, everything can begin anew. This time, you will reign over the world in the name of the master of the bottomless abyss, and with Tartarus refuge, fate can no longer easily sway you. Seek vengeance against the present world, against your children, and of course, you can choose to seek vengeance against me as well. At the time, Laine's seemingly indifferent words were filled with profound temptation. The former divine king had to believe again that language indeed possessed magic power, Hence, in the end, he let go of the past and chose to be here. However, at this moment, something unexpected arose in the original plan, but the result seemed to be even better. So, what exactly is your good news? And what does it have to do with the creation of a new world? No one could keep their cool during such a critical moment. Laine's earlier predictions had already satisfied him immensely, but now there seemed to be an even better outcome, and Cronus could hardly contain himself. With a slight smile, at this juncture, Laine had no desire to keep teasing. The specifics are quite complicated, but to put it simply, do you remember what happened when Themis was establishing the laws? I do, Cronus nodded thoughtfully. She redefined order for the present world and then expelled the residual chaos from between the laws, so you're saying? Exactly, Laine confirmed at his side. Just as the purest chaos is mixed in the present world, pure order also lingers in the abyss. Because of the gestation of the first deity, the laws within Tartarus are extremely active. The part that represents order has been instinctively expelled and mixed with some of the primitive powers lingering from the creation, which is the good news I was talking about. First let the abyss assimilate you, then take over this force rejected by it as one of its own. By that time, you will not only be able to create a realm with it but can also establish a connection with the abyss, a symbiotic, mutual devouring connection. What a pity, he lamented in the end, such opportunities are fleeting, and I can't abandon everything to embrace the abyss in my purest form as you will. Otherwise, I would be quite tempted by this opportunity myself. Ooh. Then I am rather lucky. Ha 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 ha. Unable to hold back, he finally laughed. Perhaps the ups and downs of this period had exerted a great psychological burden on the former divine king. An uncontrollable joy surged in Cronus's heart. He had not expected to have such an opportunity. Creating a realm, becoming the world master was indeed a way to aspire to reach great divine power. For a moment, he felt that all the sacrifices he had made before were worth it. Your luck is indeed not bad, so do you have any experience with creating worlds? Moreover, after being assimilated by the abyss, it's likely difficult for you to complete the task of taking that order and then betraying it, all on your own. Laine glanced at Cronus, who had come to his senses and didn't tease him further. Although he indeed intended to have a share in the new world, he did not plan to devote much effort to this matter in the future. He would be more invested in the spirit realm, and this new world situated in the abyss would partly rely on Cronus's own management. On the other hand, Laine was also prepared to let other beings come to work. I can give you this power, allowing you the strength to resist it after being transformed by the abyss. I'll use the origin of this avatar of mine. However, in the future world, I will also have my share. Not much, I only want 30%. Just 30%, which was the result of careful deliberation. If he asked for too much, then either Cronus would devote all his energy to dealing with Laine, or he might choose to let things take their own course. After all, if he did not hold the main control, striving would be meaningless. If too little, Laine felt it would also cause trouble, as it would lessen many of the former divine king's cares. He might even think of how to cut ties with Laine, even if it would deal a severe blow to the newborn world. 30% was just right, neither too much nor too little, and suited Laine's intentions perfectly. 30%, agreed. But aren't you afraid that one day I will surpass you? Calm down, and after some thought, Cronus agreed as expected but still probed with his words. If with the result of your work I hold 30%, and you can still surpass me, then it would be deserved. Shaking his head slightly, Laine had no intention of elaborating further with Cronus. It was better to leave him with some hope, and it wasn't really deceit. After all, in the eyes of the divine king, the spirit realm only represented the path leading directly to great divine power, as well as freedom beyond the control of the present world. These things, after Cronus had created a new world, would also be within his grasp. At the side, although he didn't know what working meant, the former divine king still understood the implication. He simply nodded and then urged. Then let's hurry. I remember you said that taking action at the time of an era's transition often comes with considerable aid. And my sister, who was lost here, I haven't seen her for a long time. Either. Let's go then. Nodding, Laine did not delay and led the way forward. Chapter 129, Chapter 99 The True Name. Walking through the abyss where there was no form or fixed matter, Laine and Cronus drew ever closer to the core. Visible to the naked eye, the strange characters in the surrounding space increased, along with a tone imbued with corruption and desecration that also began to resonate, echoing the distorted noise in this limitless void. But this time, Laine had recognized their origin. After Mnemosyne had lost her memory, innate script and language were her only remaining divine duties. However, the power of the former paled in comparison to the 3 maxims on the Oracle Stone tablet, and the latter, without the cooperation of speech, seemed much weaker. From this perspective, perhaps the 12 Titans were originally paired in twos, their godhoods complementing each other. In the original myths, if the god of meteorology, Creus, had not been confined to the abyss after his defeat, maybe he would have united with the goddess of justice and begotten the 3 goddesses symbolizing the seasons of spring, summer, and autumn. Of course, whether it was the original him or the now him, the abyss was probably his only destination. From this point of view, his fate was indeed deeply intertwined with Cronus. Maybe the relationship between the two as sovereign and servant could even continue, who knows? But all this had nothing to do with Mnemosyne anymore. As the god of script willingly renounced her identity as a Titan deity, she changed after being assimilated by the abyss. As the first deity of Tartarus, the 2 portions of godhood that peeled away from her were gradually corrupted over tens of thousands of years, taking on the hues of the abyss. Henceforth, the script and language here took on a special meaning. Yet, as Laine had previously surmised, script of the abyss could at most serve as a name and held no other significance. This would grant the beings born later in the abyss, as well as the lives that emerged in new worlds powered by the abyss's energy, unique names endowed with power. Yet at the same time, once their one-of-a-kind names were controlled by other lives, it would make them more susceptible to their influence and control. Based on past memories, Laine had given them a fitting term, true name. We've arrived, a truly wondrous sight. Halting his steps and observing everything before him, Laine couldn't help but marvel sincerely. The greatest artist is always nature herself. Here, perhaps due to the brief convergence of the source of order, everything looked more familiar than the rest of the abyss, much more comprehensible. Stars twinkled in the sky above, while the chaos-colored liquid churned at his feet, gathering into a sea. At the center of the ocean, a naked female being floated there. The reason for describing her as female was because the current Mnemosyne bore no resemblance to her past self. Bizarre, eerie, inscrutable, and in comparison, even the hecatonkers seemed more divine. Her very appearance was a taboo for mortals. Of course, she was no longer called Mnemosyne. The instant they laid eyes on the being before them, a new name emerged in the hearts of Laine and Cronus. Mother of demons, Moya. Just as the first primordial god, Gaia, had been chosen by the world to solely conceive the initial sky, sea, and mountains, Moya was destined to give birth to new gods, a duty assigned by Tartarus. As for whether these abyss-born deities possessed the immortal essence, akin to those of the outer world, Laine couldn't tell. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but it didn't matter, time would provide the answer. Wondrous. I can't feel it at all. Had I not witnessed it with my own eyes, I would never believe that my once beautiful sister would become like this. Even though she has not yet awakened, I can already foresee her hatred towards you. With a twitch of the mouth, the sight of Moya alone was enough to inflict spiritual harm on a deity, and Cronus truly didn't understand how Laine could utter the words a truly wondrous sight. I'm not talking about her, of course, though to speak of her might not be entirely inappropriate. Both extreme beauty and extreme ugliness are marvels carved by the world's divine craftsmanship. While that's what he said, Laine's aesthetic sense was still intact, so his gaze quickly shifted above Moya. At this moment, the gestation of the mother of demons was nearing its end. Over an epoch of lengthy time, Mnemosyne's past had nearly been scrubbed clean. It might have been more than just 10,000 years. Even amidst the abyss's distorted chronology, Laine could vaguely sense the passage of time here. At least several million years had passed for the mightiest of the primordial gods to fully assimilate a lesser god of the mortal world. This was the fundamental disparity between them. The mortal world was the face of the world biased towards order, while the abyss, it was another subject part of the world biased towards chaos. Of course, ordinary deities were even weaker, they were merely deputies of some authority on one side of the world. Is there anything we can do? In front of them, the last bits of chaotic flow still seeped into the body of the mother of demons, awaiting the right moment for her rebirth. But witnessing all this, Cronus felt a surge of murderous intent. Even though she was once his sister, she would be a demon god beneath the will of the abyss in the future. From the perspective of the newborn Moya, Laine might be the object of her hatred. However, from the mother of demons' perspective, he who sought to steal the power of the abyss might be the real enemy. By comparison, the spirit realm was far beyond the borders, while Cronus was within arm's reach. There's no way around it. The entire power of the abyss is concentrated around her, even order has been forced out. Let alone an incarnation. Even if my true form were here, I'd have no way to deal with her for the time being. Shaking his head, Tartarus was different from the other primordial gods, and Laine had no intention of provoking him either. Let go of those thoughts, after all, this is the interior of the opponent. It's only because the instinctive consciousness of the abyss is not active that we've been able to come this far. As he spoke, Laine looked above the mother of demons. There, corresponding to the chaotic currents around Moya, floated an indescribable, indefinable orb of void light above her, which was the order that had separated from the abyss. Interestingly enough, the force of chaos would inadvertently take on a serpentine form, and so would order. Laine could clearly see the coiling, serpentine presence within the orb. That is your target. Its part of the abyss's power will transform into the void that carries the new realm, along with the primal matter and spirituality, while your destiny, forever imprisoned within the abyss, will become this fourth pillar, completing the creation of the world. However, given that you first embraced the abyss and then seized its power to evolve the world, life within Tartarus may well become hostile to you and the beings within your world in the future. Let them be hostile. That is exactly what I want. If I can't gain the sovereignty of the abyss, even my reborn sister won't be able to touch the fringe of the great divine power. Nodding, Cronus seems to have regained his past fighting spirit. The power of my new realm originates from the abyss, which means that I and it can devour each other. Though I'm far from matching it, unlike its primitive and obscure thinking, I possess wisdom. I believe that even if I am not equal to it at the beginning, I will be the ultimate victor, he declared. Give it to me. Turning to Laine, the former divine king could hardly wait. Your promise, the power to break free from the abyss after I am assimilated by it. Nodding slightly, Laine extended his right hand. Immediately, a fluctuating power, most of its imprint erased, wafted towards Cronus, and as the power drifted out, the avatar also became much more ethereal. Having received this power and sensing that only 70% of it was unclaimed, Cronus pondered for a moment. He divided it equally into 10 parts, then merged it into himself. The next instant, his form, which had been difficult to observe, solidified. Your spirit realm has 7 layers. Do you have any advice about my world? He asked before the beginning. I can only talk about my intentions at the time. Numbers start at 1, are established at 3, materialize at 5, thrive at 7, and reach their peak at 9. I don't like extremes, so I only opened up 7 levels of realms, but as for you, it naturally depends on your own ideas, explained Laine. He lightly offered his advice but had no intention of making a decision for him. For mortals, it is because numbers have special meanings that they are used. But for them, it is because they imbue numbers with special meanings that they possess power. Therefore, no matter how many layers Cronus chooses to build, it won't affect the strength of the new world's power, only the structure of the world. Each layered realm has its own, and in self-recycling, there's always an advantage. Even the legends from the later East speak of a trinity of realms, the sky, earth, and man. Then let it be 9 layers. The one who always wins thinks of moderation. But I like the extremes, Cronus decided resolutely. Making his decision, Cronus no longer hesitated. His half-real, half-illusory figure leapt towards the distant orb of light. He had already thought it through, 9 layers of realm, the full force of power, he would leave out the 3rd, 5th, and 7th layers. He would construct them with the 30% of Laine's power and encase his own realms with his, and then they would each develop independently, having nothing to do with each other. In his own territory, he would not lose to anyone else. As for making a move on Laine, Cronus had not even considered it. Until he was sure he could completely defeat this enigmatic ancient god, the former divine king would only be wary of him, not hostile. In this world, there were many worthy adversaries to face, with the abyss being the most immediate one. Rather than establishing an inscrutable enemy, the present foes required more attention. Chapter 130, Chapter 100 Weaving Method. In the abyss, a new realm was being established, but unlike Laine, Cronus neither needed to create life nor to forge new laws. He was simply using pure power that had gathered when new deities were being nurtured with the help of the abyss to carve out 9 new layers of space. Even so, because the force of order and the power bestowed by Laine were not energies he had controlled for long, Cronus's world building was slower compared to the initial spirit realm. While he was shaping this new domain, progress in the outside world did not stop. At this moment, in the outer world, The world in the abyss and the present world were different, just as the early spirit realm had been, where chaos caused a disruption in the flow of time. With Laine, who had once been exposed to the chaotic source force, meddling, this disturbance was directed to elongate rather than to shorten. Therefore, although a considerable amount of time seemed to have passed in Tartarus, only a brief while had gone by in the outside world. At the center of the continent, dust arose for miles where the Mount of the Gods had fallen. In the midst of this haze, a force split into three, one drifted towards Mount Olympus, another was intercepted by the Divine King and bestowed across space to fortify the axial position of the spirit realm, augmenting the symbolic power of Mount Sinai, and the last wandered aimlessly, as if waiting for a being capable of sustaining it. With the original Mount of the Gods gone, the sky began to sway. The sole Mount Olympus located in the eastern region was not enough to maintain stability, so although the skies in the east were held aloft by the new Mount of the Gods, those in the west began to descend slowly. Of course, Mount Otherworld was no Mount Jo from the eastern mythologies of later generations, its importance was not as high. Thus, even without a new support, the heavens and the earth would not collapse into each other, bringing about the destruction of all things. It would merely descend for 9 days and nights, then rest upon the body of Mother Earth, just as in the dawn of creation. At this moment, at the heart of the continent, the two ancient gods causing all this upheaval were wholly unconcerned with the changes in the sky. Their colossal forms colliding with the earthy glow shook the boundless land. Ravines formed, mountains crumbled, rivers were severed, the earth reshaped, and watercourses rerouted. Far off above the East Sea, the blue-clad Hecate, holding the Book of All Laws, listened to the thunderous noises coming from the distant horizon. Though not on sight, she could guess what was happening there. The Divine King, that she had once duped with her concocted potion, was exhibiting a level of power beyond her imagination. Tablet, is that really the Divine King? I can't believe he's so formidable. I think Golden Mane might not be much of a match. If the Divine King deals with them, will he come looking for me? Before, Hecate hadn't taken the matters of the Divine King to heart mainly because she felt his strength, though considerable, was within an acceptable range. After all, even though he had defeated the god of the ocean and his spouse, he hadn't done so with absolute superiority. But considering the current situation, she believed that the god of the ocean couple, on whom she had pinned high hopes, would be crushed by his single hand. This made Hecate start to worry, so she hastily consulted her ultimate backer to see if they could withstand it. If they couldn't, she would need to grab her things and flee in haste. Work could wait, but if she were caught and thrown into the abyss, it would be a dire predicament. Do not worry, his current state won't last long. Focus more on the magic net for now. This time, Hecate distinctly noticed that the tablet was slow to respond. However, she didn't think much of it, assuming that it was also silently assessing the Divine King's suddenly revealed formidable prowess. What a devious creature, possessing such strength, he could have captured Golden Mane long ago, yet he stayed hidden. Well then, don't lie to me. Otherwise, if he comes knocking, I'll say you tricked me into it. She joked casually, then asked. Should I take care of that guy on the side? He's been stealthily following me for a while now, acting as though I haven't noticed him. Her gaze flicked sideways. On a small island thousands of miles away, there was a being with the upper body of a human and a lower body of a horse, secretly watching. Although he didn't seem very serious, compared to the strange and bizarre sea monsters, Hecate was barely willing to recognize him as a normal life form. However, her senses told her he was peculiar. He possessed divinity, something innate to him, not granted by others. He also had a near-godly physique, but like Hecate, she sensed no godhood in him. Furthermore, he lacked even the immortality fundamental to gods, proving that he was mortal. Such beings, uncertain if they were gods or not, were even more scorned by other deities than territorial gods. It's up to you, but the other party didn't offend you, did they? Perhaps he was simply attracted by the knowledge you've displayed. Once the magic net is completed, maybe he can become one of your followers, even the first user of the magic net. Fine, let's just leave him be. With a slight nod, Hecate accepted this reasoning. She hadn't planned on killing the other party over such a small matter. However, she was still somewhat curious about the state of that half-human, half-horse life form. He is not a god, right? He doesn't seem like a sea monster either, but he is naturally divine. How can this be? As the world tends toward perfection, it no longer desperately needs a multitude of immortal deities. This centaur indeed descends from gods, but he, himself, is just a demigod. Nodding thoughtfully, Hecate continued to inquire. Centaur, a descriptive name. A god begetting a demigod with another god. Seems more pitiful than my own beginnings. So, who are his parents? Did they also fear worldly punishment and thus cast him out? Perhaps because of a potentially similar experience, Hecate began to take a liking to this half-man, half-horse life form. If he were sensible, it wouldn't be bad to take him in as a subordinate. Although Selene was also considered her apprentice, she was, after all, a friend, and Hecate couldn't simply order her around. But this centaur was different. This time, though, even as she asked her question, no writing appeared on the tome of all spells. If you won't tell, don't I'll just ask him myself when the time comes. Realizing the slate's intentional concealment, Hecate huffed lightly, but on her current blue-haired, blue-dressed self, it hardly seemed intimidating. The disturbance in the distant horizon grew more intense. Hecate could vaguely make out that the sun in the sky had also grown larger somehow. But this did not affect her. The time was almost upon her, and opening the divine artifact in her hands, a look of solemnity crept over the gentle visage of blue-robed Hecate for the first time. When her expression became serious, coupled with her altered appearance, she truly exuded a sense of profound depth and transcendence from the world. Today is the day I become a deity. In a quiet whisper, the next moment, silvery flames drifted from Hecate's body, and the curled magic net slowly unfolded, stretching across hundreds of miles in an instant. As the embryonic magic net opened up, guided by the tome of all spells, countless invisible strands materialized from the void and surged crazily toward the great net. They were ignited by the silver fire and then merged with it as one. Hecate could vaguely sense a vast and limitless consciousness descending around her, connecting with the magic net's embryonic form. It was the spirit realm, which she had encountered more than once. In the past, she felt like a person walking the earth, aware of its vastness but never truly knowing its expanse. But now, as the will of the spirit realm descended willingly, Hecate finally felt the awe of facing this grandeur. Being but a mayfly in the vast cosmos, a mere grain in the vast sea, was probably no different than this. Born from patterns, succeed through likening. Regaining composure, raising the divine artifact high, Hecate seemed spiritually cleansed but quickly returned to the present moment. At this time, she could feel that every place covered by the spirit realm was vividly clear at the bottom of her heart. So, she smiled and once again announced her arrival to the world. Witnessed by the great ancient spirit world, I am the master of the magic net, the source of all spells. In the starry sky, a special star shone brightly, illuminating the surrounding areas. Wherever the spirit realm reached within the world, endless threads wove into a net. Silver fire filled the heavens, and almost in an instant, it spread from a tiny cluster along the invisible tracks laid by the spirit realm's power, igniting the sky, the ocean, and the land. At the same time as the spirit realm's power poured in, new divine aspects and laws descended upon Hecate. The present world responded in kind, and, as if witnessing a divine phenomenon, an invisible wave swept across the world. All deities knew that a new true god had been born above the East Sea. But only a few knew that this was not just a divine birth, for this deity had already been born once before. Master of the magic net, Hecate. The next moment, the new god's great name shook the source sea, and the bridge between the spirit realm and the present world appeared. Under the subtle protection of the divine authority, in this crucial moment of an epical turnover, the original magic net was finally completed. Chapter 131. Chapter 101, Insight into the Mysteries of Authority. The magic web, a network that constrains elements and regulates order. The latter is not yet evident, as the concepts reliant on the magic web are few at present, but the former's influence is immediate and apparent. When the magic web formed, the once chaotically unordered elements instantly found their carriers, for the magic web itself embodies some of the elemental divine authority. From then on, except in a few areas not covered by the magic web, any mortal thing required the magic web's permission to manipulate elemental power. Of course, the current magic web is impartially open to all life. It doesn't care whether you are good or evil, as long as you follow its rules, it will serve you. Is this the world as seen through the eyes of a true god? How wonderful, under the influence of divine authority. Even if my understanding of the law's origin is superficial, it still obeys my will, just like mortals who do not comprehend the mysteries of the birth of life. Yet that doesn't affect their existence in the world. Above the East Sea, the silver fire had somehow vanished into the void, leaving no trace. Upon Hecate's slender body, a faint stream of divine power began to flow. With each passing moment, it grew exponentially stronger than the moment before. As this ascent continued, perhaps after several breaths, the surge of power gradually broke through to the realm of intermediate divine power, and then the rate of increase began to slow. This was the result of thousands of years of accumulation by the newly born goddess of the magic web, but now it was also spent. The magic web is, after all, merely a tool that binds elements and connects spirituality with matter, and its own strength is not formidable. Only with a sufficient number of users, or even by broadening its own concepts, might it be possible to support Hecate taking another step further. After all, this is not a power that was meant to appear in fate, and the world will not pour extra source power into it for its sake. This is an embodiment of the world's favoritism towards the gods. You have some understanding of the magic web itself, and you participated personally in the weaving of the prototype of the magic web, along with observing the movement of elements in all parts of the world. Hence, regarding your own divine authority, although you claim to barely understand, your grasp is actually quite good. Even the gods cannot compare with you. They use their authority instinctively, without understanding the underlying mechanisms, unknown to them why and how their powers work. Their godhood is simply a result of being well born. Beside Hecate, with the birth of the magic web, the tome of all spells, which also experienced a unique change, slowly began to show its text once again. This time was different. Last time the slate was stuck simply because Hecate criticized the divine king, leaving it a bit at a loss for words. But this time, it was truly overwhelmed. It was simultaneously contending with the strongest deity in the present world, spectating the creation in the abyss, and, at the same time as the birth of the magic web, approving with divine authority, granting the spirit realm the qualifications to be open to the current world. Multitasking to this extent and still having free time to answer queries was somewhat difficult. I see. But having personally experienced it once, I've realized that pure mortals cannot become deities on their own. The divine offices inherent in the world are not their domain. And like the creation of the magic web, creating something new is quite difficult to achieve with one's strength. The birth of the magic web still had the support of the spirit realm, but what about humans? They don't have a source of power, do they? After muttering a complaint, Hecate speculated that the key to mortals becoming deities might also lie in creation, since she had ascended to godhood through creation of the magic web. But this sort of creation is not simply about inventing something and declaring I made XXX, witness world, and it's done. That's meaningless. Creating a material object does not mean you will receive godhood. Whether the material world is willing to grant you that divine office is the crux. Because strictly speaking, it's not that the world creates corresponding laws because you created that thing, but rather the opposite. The world first produces the corresponding source power, extends into laws, and then you can create that thing. Just like Laine at the dawn of creation tried to make fire, but to no avail. Because at that time, there was no origin of fire in the world, so the existence of fire did not exist in the world at that time. If the world is a program, then origin is like its base code. Without the support of the code, no matter how logical your actions, success will not be achieved if it's unsupported. Creating new concepts is something a complete world can do. The spirit realm theoretically could too, but constrained by the current strength of its master, it could only proceed in a roundabout manner like the magic web. Nectar is no different. Although Laine received the authority of nectar early in the birth of the spirit realm, the first bottle of wine he made in his world was merely a catalyst. If the origin corresponding to nectar had not yet existed, he wouldn't have been able to even create the substance named wine. Fortunately, in the subsequent traditional myths, wine did exist in the world before the god of wine was born. Although Laine didn't know when the origin related to nectar was born in the world, at least it existed by the time he established the spirit realm. This also reaffirmed that mere creation of a material object does not grant godhood. Despite Laine not knowing who in the original myth created nectar, the subsequent god of wine wasn't him. As for how the material world decides on the bestowal of divine offices, it is much like the splitting of divine authority when a new god is born, entirely determined by fate. Fate decides if you should have it. You do, even taking it from someone else to give to you. If fate decides not, then it simply doesn't exist. No matter if you are the world's first inventor, it will still have nothing to do with you. Though Laine was born, this situation had in fact not changed, it was only that he himself was not subject to this limitation. Apart from the origin taken by the spirit realm, the power in the present world still followed the logic of destining to whom it belongs. If it's not in fate, creating more is meaningless. Thus, it's reasonable for the deities to despise the present world. After all, it was only when the world's manifestation of order took shape that everything was arranged so rigidly and methodically. In contrast, in the abyss, when Mnemosyne, who was not meant to appear there according to the later ages' trajectory, entered Tartarus, the abyss embraced the newcomer without hesitation. For the abyss, there is nothing predestined. With few exceptions affecting itself, it appears laissez-faire in all other aspects. Forget it, it's none of my concern. Shaking her head, Hecate wasn't particularly bothered by it. She didn't have any urgent desire to elevate mortals to godhood. After all, the tablet said to trust the wisdom of future generations, so let her see what kind of wisdom they could possess. But what's going on here? Her expression shifted as if Hecate had noticed something. Focusing intently, within her divine perception, the massive barrier between the spirit realm's space-time and the present world seemed to have disappeared. Without a surprise, now even without the aid of a ritual, as long as one had a mental level equivalent to her engraving the third phase of the moon, one could explore the first layer of the spirit realm with their spiritual body. This was unimaginable before. The barrier, mixed with space-time and uncertain fate, was something even the two primordial gods couldn't do anything about when they first came into being. Normal changes, no need to pay heed. Since you've created the magic web, it naturally needs users. Although the object of meditation doesn't necessarily have to be the moon of the spirit realm, the environment there is indeed the most suited for the growth of the spirit. Using any excuse, the opening of the spirit realm had been long prepared, it was just that now was the time for implementation. Previously, the present world was separated from the spirit realm by space-time, accessible by only a few beings. If that seal were broken at that time, not to mention the possible issue of being located by other deities, just the conflict between the worlds would be quite a trouble. When the spirit realm, an interface originally independent from the present world, came into direct contact with it, conflict between the two worlds was almost foreseeable. Undoubtedly, although today's spirit realm was far superior to what it once was, yet it had not reached the point of overpowering the present world. Now, however, things were different. On one hand, the magic web served as a lubricant between the two worlds, with element, the special existence that could be influenced by the spirit and change matter, successfully easing the conflict. On the other hand, the divine authority granted the spirit realm a legal entry pass. As a result, the divine authority's presence plummeted, but the spirit realm itself was accepted by the present world. Just like the abyss, although Tartarus, as a major part independent of the present world, was rejected by it, contact itself would not cause conflict. Its portal in the underworld served as the point of contact between the two. The spirit realm's points were just more, it spanned every corner of the world. I see. That's interesting. In that case, the deities should also be able to enter the spirit realm now. Aren't you afraid they'll wreak havoc? Unaware of the various secrets behind it, Hecate simply raised an eyebrow, asking pointedly. Past experiences told her that the tablet was somewhat wary of the deities before. It might not be the ones frequently walking the world, but they were not fearless either. Not afraid. When this age ends, within the spirit realm, no matter how many outside deities there are, it will make no difference. In a while, you can go and observe, perhaps you will have some revelations. Still without any intent to disguise its meaning, the black inscriptions did not deny their connection to the spirit realm, but hinted that at the end of this era, a significant event would take place there. Alright, I will. Hecate puffed her cheeks, her gaze inadvertently sweeping over the reflection on the sea's surface. As if reminded of something, she twirled, and when she stopped, she was back in her once familiar red dress. Yet, if one looked closely, they could still see that, after ascending to godhood, she was slightly different from before. Chapter 132, Chapter 102, The Great Sun. I should get used to this appearance a bit more. By the way, Slate, you've said before that the gods do not understand the mysteries of their own authority. What about you? There was a hint of curiosity. After all, Hecate was not capable of doing it at the moment, and she also felt that it was extraordinarily difficult to accomplish. However, this time, the Book of All Laws did not reveal any follow-up content. Because in fact, Hecate was quite right, even he himself was actually unable to fully comprehend the principles behind the authority he wielded. When standing high above, although one can overlook the entirety of mountains and rivers, one can never see what's at one's feet. And if one is born high above, then it's impossible to experience the process of climbing up from below, which is true for all gods, himself included. He had considered completing this part, but it was not a simple task. Forget it, Just watch the drama unfold. Aside, although she did not receive a response, the answer had already become quite evident. Thus, Hecate smiled, then shifted her focus away from these matters. As for the centaur peeking from the side, she would deal with him after today's affairs were over, as she currently had no time to spare for him. She looked towards the distant continent where the battle continued unabated, not at all affected by the transient scene of silver fire that had just flickered by. The birth of the magic net was crucial for Hecate, and it held exceptional significance for both the spirit realm and the current world. But for the gods at this moment, other than proving there was one more deity in the world, it had no further meaning. Even the slowly descending western sky was not a concern to the gods at this time, let alone the minor disturbances above the East Sea. The divine king was contesting with Mother Earth, who was clearly at a disadvantage. Apart from the coupled god of the ocean and Zeus being barely able to interfere, the other true gods could only protect themselves from the shockwaves of the collision and were unable to influence the battle's tide. But in the starry heavens, the sun, which had lost control due to Helios hiding in the East Sea, was undergoing subtle changes unnoticed. Crack. In the midst of the grand sun, besides the substance flowing like liquid, there was nothing else. Or to be precise, even if there was, it would have been burned to ashes long ago. Here, nothing but the sun itself could exist, aside from its master and those chains that had been in place for thousands of years. His limbs shackled, Hyperion twisted his body unconsciously, weary from the effort. Having heard Cronus's voice before, the sun god imprisoned for thousands of years, had at one point struggled in fury. But ultimately, restrained by the sealing chains, he was unable to break free. As his rage gradually dissipated, Hyperion lay back at the core of the sun, no longer wasting his strength in vain. Over the years, he had come to understand that the seal was not something he could shake with his power. His previous defiance was merely an impulsive reaction to his emotions. Of course, he had not given up. The god of sun was just waiting for an opportunity. He knew that unless Cronus truly became the eternal divine king, the seal he left would inevitably weaken during the transition of divine kings. The second-generation divine king was not their father. Only divine authority wholly derived from the heavens could remain effective after its master had lost power. A kingship formed by opportunity would naturally lose its strength as its legitimacy faded. All he had to do was wait for that opportunity. Once the seal began to wane, Hyperion might have a chance to escape. He did not know how long it would be, but all he could do was wait. Crack. The previously tranquil core of the sun emitted another sound. At first, the god of sun paid it no heed, thinking it was just some random noise produced as the sun traveled its orbit, strange, but not worth concern. However, upon hearing the sound a second time, the unrecognizable tune finally caught his attention. He had been in this place for thousands of years, and knew every nuance of the sun's core. Hence, an unexpected shift naturally could not escape his notice. Listening intently, the god of sun needed to determine the origin of the sound. After a short while, with less time elapsed since the last, he heard the noise once again, as he had hoped. Crack. The third strange sound came. This time, Hyperion finally realized where the sound was coming from. Looking in the direction of the noise, he saw it was the sealing chains bound to his hands. Unbeknownst to him, fine lines had already spread across the chains on his wrists. The sounds he had just heard were those tiny cracks expanding. This is. At first, the god of sun did not grasp what was happening. But soon, the sealing chains, which had long ceased receiving a steady influx of power, began to gradually erode under the sheer force of the sun itself. From tiny fissures to inch-long meltdowns, the seal's disintegration progressed at an alarmingly visible speed, akin to an avalanche. This is. Jolted to sudden awareness, Hyperion, realizing what was unfolding, stared fixedly at the disintegrating chains. He had no knowledge of what had transpired outside, clueless as to why, right after hearing Cronus's voice, his own seals began to crumble. But he did not care for such matters. Thousands of years of imprisonment had not extinguished the fiery passion within the god of sun, rather, it had only grown more intense. Perhaps it was because he had spent too long at the sun's core that the influence of his godhood of sun seemed to strengthen. Now, Hyperion was more under the sway of the sun's will itself. Without any reservations or limits, to dominate the starry heavens, this was the sun's innate impulse. With the weakening of his chains, the familiar sensation of power slowly returned. As divine energy, silent for millennia, reconvened, the god of sun's gaze penetrated the supreme celestial body and settled on the distant lands. He immediately discerned the boundless colossal silhouette but felt not an ounce of dread at the sight. Hyperion recognized that being, although its aura felt somewhat strange and its appearance somewhat different. The most crucial temporal and spatial divine authority undeniably confirmed to him that this was an old friend, the second divine king, Cronus, who had sealed him here. He was in battle, and his adversary was their shared mother goddess. He seemed invincible, but the god of sun harbored no fear. Although he could not perceive the slightest flaw in the other's power, Cronus appeared invulnerable, absolutely dominating Mother Earth. How could the disintegrating seal, dissipating without cause, be a falsehood? If this was truly the extent of the adversary's power, why would he need to reclaim such an insignificant amount of strength? The only answer was that the other was merely putting on an act. Perhaps he had found a way to temporarily elevate his power, but this could not last. The crumbling seal was the undeniable proof. Chapter 133, Chapter 103 Descent to the Mortal World. Ah, so that's it. It seems you've encountered trouble, my dear brother, so much so that even this little power you must take back. If I weren't right here, it's quite possible you would have deceived me too. But rest assured, to thank you for your past favor, I'll soon contribute to your might. The seals around him became increasingly incomplete, or rather, its insides had long been hollowed out. Hyperion stretched his body slightly, and with a series of resounding echoes, the final chains of the seal were also dispersed. In nearly an instant, as the ancient god of sun's power was unbound, the great sun changed hands in a moment, returning to the embrace of its former master. Originally, Hyperion's retroactive actions had repulsed the sun, but Helios's crafting of the sun chariot with godhood was even more unacceptable to this supreme celestial body. A divine artifact to drive the sun was liked by the divine king, by the other deities, and by the laws of the current world, but the only one who did not like it was the sun itself. The sun, how could it submit to being under someone? Ha 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 ha. That's right. Cronus and even my foolish son, they do not understand you, but I do. With a soft whisper and a wild smile, feeling the sun's accumulated dissatisfaction over thousands of years, Hyperion heartily invited his old friend. Come now, cast aside the laws of this current world. Let's together stage a grand spectacle to announce the return of the ruler of the stars. At this moment, the starry sky was uninhabited, especially near the sun. It was as if they had long anticipated what was to occur. The stars of the zodiac regions had already concealed themselves. The stars they represented were still hanging there, but that's because they were the projection of the spirit realm's stars into the outer space. Just like the nether moon, which seemed to hang above the underworld but was in fact untouchable to any deity. Besides, among the deities of the starry sky, the goddess of light took refuge in the light regions. The deities of the lightless celestial bodies never made a display. The god of the sky and goddess of daylight remained uninvolved with the world, and thus in the heavens, unnoticed, silently, the great sun changed masters once again. Only Helios, who had long since defected in secret and was hiding in the sea palace with his wife, the goddess of boiling water, noticed the change in the sun's sovereignty. But at this time, he was already too concerned to care about these matters. That supremely majestic vision on the horizon almost scared him out of his wits, and the youthful god of sun truly couldn't believe that the divine king, who had appeared increasingly dejected in recent years, could suddenly erupt with such power. If I had known you were this outrageously strong, I would definitely have been your most loyal and unrivaled subordinate. However, no one cared what he thought, or rather, now many gods shared his sentiment. They were confident in their siege of Mount Otherworld, even privately discussing the division of spoils after the battle and how to limit the new divine king's influence, but none of them expected that all their actions were a joke in the eyes of the supreme being on Mount Otherworld. In a single encounter, without any significant divine power fluctuation, the divine king still single-handedly subdued the deities. This unparalleled power made the titans present recall the past. How Heavenly Father Uranus, too, had been this way. Even in the last moments of the current world, he still suffocated the deities to breathlessness. 10,000 years have passed, they had become stronger. The titans believed that even if they faced Heavenly Father again, they would still have the power to fight, but reality told them, nothing had changed. The divine king is still the supreme of the world. Think of something. Zeus, you have been chosen by fate as the divine king. Quickly think of a solution. The mother goddess is no match for him. Now only you can change the outcome. His body trembling slightly, the ocean deity sovereign had lost his past grandeur, and his voice was somewhat out of character, nothing like his usual imposing and steady self. At this moment, Oceanus remembered his own past. How just under his father's gaze, he knelt before the Heavenly Father, proving he would dare not challenge him. Now stronger than before, he felt no different in the face of the new Divine King. Even if he hadn't known that his submission would not be accepted, he would have surrendered long ago. But whether to give up was meaningless, the impact he had on Cronus was almost nil. Now, Zeus was his last lifeline. Despite the fact that the other's power was not enough to change the course of the battle, he represented the prophecy of fate and the curse of the Heavenly Father. I will do my best. With a forced smile, Zeus clutched at the wounds on his body, trying to heal. Perhaps because of Mother Earth's arrival, the Divine King no longer focused on these weaker deities, giving them a respite around the Mount of the Gods. Feeling his father-in-law's somewhat uncontrollable emotions, Zeus reminisced about the Titan's original title. If the Titans of yesteryear were so submissive in front of the Heavenly Father, it was no wonder that he disdainfully bestowed upon them the title Titan. But thinking was one thing, and the current opposing party was after all an ally to him. However, when Zeus tried to offer some words of comfort, he searched his mind and couldn't find a single thing to say. After all, faced with such a situation, he really couldn't think of any variables left to consider. In the past, except for that one setback in the hands of the red-haired witch, Zeus had it all smooth sailing, everything going his way. He married the most intelligent goddess and even entangled with her sister. Being forced into the abyss, the strength of the Hecatonkers during the 10-year war made him feel it was all worth it, until now. He couldn't understand. If Cronus had possessed such power before, why did he confront them for so long instead of toppling Olympus with an invincible stance on the first day of the war, making it clear that the Divine King's authority was unquestionable? He didn't even need to wait until then. Early on, when he rescued his 5 siblings, the Divine King could have shown Gaia with absolute power that whatever the giants were, they were not my brothers, they were merely a bunch of monsters. What you think they are doesn't matter. What matters is what I say they are, and that's what they are. I don't want the giants to leave the abyss, then they will stay obediently there. I want these rebels in my belly, then no one can let them out. Perhaps this was just a way for him to satisfy his own amusement. He never cared about me, my struggles and efforts, they were just a joke in his eyes. Somewhat powerless, but Zeus still gripped the arrow of thunder tightly. He would never speak of surrender until the very last moment. Wait, what's that? Suddenly, a voice filled with puzzlement and surprise sounded. Looking towards the source of the voice, at his father-in-law's side, the original goddess of water was gazing up at the sky. Chapter 134, Chapter 104, The Sense of Ceremony. Zeus turned around and saw her, his mother-in-law, the primeval water goddess, Thesis. She was looking in the direction of the starry sky, where the great sun that had been suspended at its zenith suddenly began to enlarge. From a deity's perspective, she could very clearly discern that the sun's true body was falling toward the center of the continent. Such an act that went against the rules of the current world could never be spontaneous. Behind it, there must be a god of sun manipulating it. How could this be? Wasn't Helios still at sea? And if he had the courage to face the Divine King directly, he wouldn't be making excuses to stay in the ocean. Wait, this isn't Helios, this is Hyperion. Where has the seal gone? At first it was somewhat incomprehensible, but the next moment Oceanus too grasped what was happening in an instant. The sun would not leave its orbit for no reason, and Hyperion would not break free from his seal without cause. If there had to be a reason, it was that the seal had been unlocked willingly or unwillingly. In what situation would Cronus remove the seal he had once set? Ha ha ha, I knew it, he couldn't have suddenly become so powerful. He must have used some means, it has to be this way, but now, his power has begun to wane. Zeus, take action, he is just holding on. Amidst the ups and downs of emotions, Oceanus finally regained his confidence. His divine power began to boil, and in the distant horizon, the world surrounding river seemed to sense its master's impassioned mood. At the end of the ocean, a blue light began to fluctuate, inching upward. It was the water level of the river rising, consequently rolling up to the sky. For a moment, even the surface of the sea beyond seemed to rise by 3 parts. Cronus, just as you had faced the Father God before, no matter how you struggle, failure is your ultimate fate. As the voice of the god of the ocean spread in all directions, accompanied by the increasingly evident path of the great sun, the deities who had understood the celestial affairs even if only slightly, all came to realize. The Divine King's seal had vanished, sweeping away the passive despair in the air, and as they looked toward Cronus, their will to fight was reignited. For the innate gods, they exercise authority by instinct rather than technique, and thus their power can often fluctuate wildly with their state of mind. But at this moment, as the sun drew ever closer, they seemed to have regained their confidence. The sun of today was not the one that had just been born in ancient times. Over tens of thousands of years, as the world itself kept improving, its power had risen accordingly. If it weren't for the division of the great sun, perhaps Hyperion would have long reached the level 20 of divine power. At this moment, as its true body fell, it was an unimaginable disaster. The sun, it's always him, must say, we indeed share quite the fate, he muttered softly, yet in the voice of a titan, it was like thunder. Contrary to what the gods had expected, Cronus, amidst the connection between heaven and earth within his towering figure, did not show any emotional fluctuation. He simply pressed down on the earth with his left hand and then raised his eyes to the sky. The reactions of the surrounding gods did not concern him. Whether they were a bit stronger or weaker, apart from Zeus wielding lightning and the couple of the god of the ocean who posed a slight threat, they were all a joke to him. By comparison, the rapidly approaching sun was slightly more interesting. But only slightly so. If it weren't for Mother Earth, if he didn't have to consider the divine authority that had been largely exhausted, the current sun wouldn't even qualify to be looked upon by him. Compared to the concept of the moon he wielded, it would take at least another epoch before the true body of the sun could rise along with the overall increase in Chaos's strength and further touch the realm of great divine power. Before then, it might have a capacity comparable to Gaia's current state, but it lacked the quality to shake what was truly great. In such a situation, the Divine King might find it difficult to destroy the sun itself, but there was more than one way to deal with it. However, since he had come to make an impact, he would naturally choose the most direct method. Hyperion, I once said if you sought revenge on your son first, I would spare you. But now, it seems you didn't seize the chance I gave you. Well, perhaps fate has influenced this too. After all, the fall of the Titans is also a part of destiny. With a light chuckle, an invisible force surged. Accompanied by the spread of time-space power once again, the deity suffered as if struck by lightning. The power of Cronus didn't feel weak at all, on the contrary, there were signs of rising again at this moment. Seeing this, the ocean deity sovereign couldn't even afford to care about the divine king's mention of the fall of the Titans. He merely ascended to the sky, aiming to launch a pincer attack on the advancing sun. Stop your pretense, Cronus, I've seen through your tricks, even your own seal. Don't be hasty, Oceanus, your turn is coming soon. A glance was all it took to silence the words that the god of the ocean was about to utter. Maybe it was because there were too many changes today. Oceanus did look a bit different from usual. The divine king even thought he seemed like a jest used to heighten the atmosphere. Of course, it was also possible that once these seemingly lofty beings lost their support, they were indeed no different from ordinary people. But since you still haven't given up. With no more waiting, the divine king's right hand reached out, shading the heavens and earth with its illusory form. As the sun approached, under the gaze of the gods, Cronus didn't wait for the sun to collide. He grabbed at the massive body of light ahead of it. In the face of his power at this moment, the starry space was mere inches, size and scale had lost their meaning. So the next moment, amidst innumerable horrified gazes, the divine king stretched out his hand and grasped the sun in his palm. Impossible. A roar came from within the sun, and the entire celestial body shook violently, the illusionary giant hand also becoming slightly unstable. But in the end, without touching the great power, it ultimately failed to shake the divine king. Just like holding a glowing sphere, the divine king drew his hand back, holding it in front of him. Fate or accident, either is possible, but that's not important anymore. Whether it's by chance or destined, I'll not refuse it. Especially since I am the divine king, what he once did, I naturally cannot be absent from. He remembered the past Uranus, when he himself was still very weak. Uranus's might represented the ultimate in his imagination. Hyperion, did you know, life always needs a sense of ritual, and being the divine king is no different. Let me personally put the final period on your chapter. Chapter 135. Chapter 105 Bathing in the East Sea. Hyperion did not know what a period was, for at that time, text did not require punctuation to break sentences. But even so, the ancient god of sun still understood the meaning behind Cronus's words. Impossible, how could you still possess such power? You clearly no longer have the ability to seal my power, so how could you have the strength to oppose the sun itself? One moment he was full of pride, the next he had fallen into the abyss. Hyperion had not expected that his anticipated glorious return would go bankrupt before it even started. To seize the sun single-handedly was an event last known to occur 10,000 years ago, but it defied all logic. The seal was intended only for him personally, yet now Cronus was opposing the entire sun. If he still had such strength to spare, why would he release Hyperion's seal? Struggling fiercely, the god of sun tried to prove the other was merely bluffing, but although the great orb expanded and contracted with its master's resistance, it seemed absurdly comical within the colossal hand formed from the void. It wasn't without effect. Powers of this level, even the current divine king could not ignore. But having an effect and being able to escape were clearly not the same thing. Stop wasting your efforts, I warned you, Hyperion, but you obviously did not take heed. With a light laugh, the power of space and time circled around him. Cronus looked towards the sun and also the figure within it. Unsurprisingly, this should be the last time he communicated with the other party. But no matter. Firstly, to give hope and then to shatter it by hand is indeed the best way to teach irreverence. Especially you, my child. As though he had thought of something, the divine king slightly lowered his head. That face as vast as the heavens looked down, parting the thunderclouds in layers, and casting upon Zeus's face of despair. The thunderbolts, enhanced by his divine artifact, resembled mere adornments for the divine king, with silver serpents dancing and writhing, causing mere ripples on the Titan's body, yet to no avail. Zeus, my rebellious child, as your father, today I will teach you another lesson. Cronus sneered as he glanced over at Oceanus, the god of the ocean. He paid no more attention to the still shouting god of sun, but raised the hand holding the great orb high, then smashed it down towards the east. Endurance, at times, is necessary. Otherwise, your uncles today will be your tomorrow. To hold the sun and the moon, to compress 1,000 mountains, playing with the universe. Before this god reaching from earth to sky, half of the continent was within arm's reach. An era had passed, and after the age of Uranus, the sun was once again in contact with his old friend. And so on this day, the great orb bathed in the East Sea. In the north of the continent, within a secluded valley. Far from the battlefield of the deities, far from the strife of the world, the god of speech, Iapetus, resided here in solitude. Originally, after the creation of mankind, his whole family had come here together. However, later on, his eldest son and second son, Prometheus and Epimetheus, chose Olympus together. The forethinker claimed that they had offended the divine king by creating humans, and due to his brother Atlas's situation, it was inevitable they would face hostility from Olympus. Therefore, he took Epimetheus with him to serve the new king foretold by fate. As for his wife, the goddess of renown Clymene, she could never endure the loneliness here, rarely returning throughout the year. She thought her husband was unaware, but Iapetus knew very well that she had met the newly appointed god of sun, Helios, at the abode of the hot springs goddess. However, the god of speech chose to let things take their own course. In fact, in terms of strength, they were quite evenly matched. Since he couldn't stop her, he might as well stay in this valley alone, enjoying tranquility. It was only today that he had witnessed in a short span the fall of Mount of the Gods, the westward descent of the sky, as well as the giant god who seemed to split heaven and earth, plucking the sun and pressing it towards the East Sea. Everything was so shocking, yet there was something familiar about it all. After all, he had witnessed similar scenes more than once. Some were in the last epoch, the most recent being that illusory vision. Even though it was but a fleeting moment, Iapetus's memory of it remained fresh. Is this the future I had seen before? I never expected it to unfold so quickly, he murmured. Compared to that scene, however, this still seems to lack something. Muttering to himself, the god of speech still vividly remembered that scene, even after many years. Silver. Serpents frenzied in the sky, where darkness intertwined with illusions, and a towering figure enveloped in the power of time and space grasped a blazing orb of light, fiercely pressing it towards the east. It was a scene Iapetus caught a glimpse of the first time he entered the spirit realm. Now, except for the dark and illusory images, everything else had come to pass. The silver serpent came from the firstborn of the divine king. The orb of light was supreme in the starry sky, and that towering figure was the divine king who reigned supreme over all. At least, it looked like the divine king. This world is still too dangerous. A misstep, and one becomes a pawn in the struggle between the great beings. My previous decision was wise indeed. It's better to let them resolve such matters of power and influence on their own. Shaking his head, Iapetus couldn't help but think of his wife. She had gone to the East Sea again, But now that place was probably not so safe, and he wondered how she, ever so keen on fame, felt now. After all, the young god of sun probably wasn't feeling very comfortable, given that a collision of symbols of godhood would inevitably affect the deities themselves. Be it Helios or Hyperion, or even Oceanus, the god of the ocean, they were likely experiencing a pain that penetrated the soul. He had lived through the last epoch, and when Uranus cast the sun into the great ocean, the god of speech was right there. The Heavenly Father had only tested the waters back then, but the reactions of the two titans were etched in his memory. And the primordial gods. Truly formidable. Who knows how things will turn out? Will the gods be tolerated if they continue to unleash their powers with such abandon in this world? Feeling somewhat apprehensive, and piecing together his own experiences with some rumors, Epidus had also guessed what the darkness and the illusion were. Three beings, each having touched the great divine power and clashing in this world, would have consequences beyond the god of speech's imagination. He didn't know which of them was the director behind all this or who would be the final victor, but regardless of the outcome, the next epoch was likely to be much different from the present. But that has nothing to do with me. He was once just a messenger, and now, even more a mere observer. Epidus knew of no other ability. Not even deeming himself as wise as his children, he knew but one thing: never to meddle in affairs beyond his capacity. And so, the god of speech watched as an audience, witnessing the end of the second epoch. Chapter 136, Chapter 106 Influence. No. The joys and sorrows of people do not communicate with one another. As the god of speech lightly indulged in the pleasure of imagining Helios's fate, a desperate shout accompanied by terror emerged over the East Sea, where the young sun god observed the events unfolding before his eyes in horror. Not long ago, having just sensed the changing ownership of the sun, Helios had once considered an idea similar to that of ocean deity sovereign. Perhaps something had gone wrong with the divine king, and his previous behaviors were all just for show. But he wasn't actually pleased by this. A simple change of the divine king was acceptable, but the breaking of the seal meant that his father would also be released. Hyperion and Cronus had a long-standing grudge, but it wasn't certain that the new divine king would still seek to target this titan deity. That's why he secretly rebelled, yet did not join the assault on Mount of the Gods or display loyalty before the new master. Although the seal within the sun would weaken with the turning of the era, it didn't mean that Hyperion would definitely be able to escape. However, if he openly rebelled, then the divine king would certainly actively break the seal. But now, he no longer needed to worry about that. For high above, the sun was plummeting towards the East Sea at a speed far beyond Helios's imagination. Great sounds are silent, great forms are shapeless. When an enormous hand formed from the void seized the sun, one couldn't perceive its existence standing nearby. In the young sun god's eyes, a formidable power that he couldn't comprehend was enveloping the massive celestial body, allowing it to move at an unimaginable speed. He could feel his father's struggle and the sun's resistance, but all resistance seemed meaningless against the force that wrapped around them. The next moment, right before his eyes, the heavenly body made contact with the ocean, and boundless light and heat erupted at the center of the East Sea. There was no sound of collision, because the sun and the sea water did not actually collide. The sea water couldn't even touch the sun's true form, vaporizing instantly in the unquantifiable high temperatures. Transforming into steam, they expanded, some drawn high into the sky, some sinking to the ocean floor. The friction between the air currents and the sea water stirred up waves and storms 1,000 times more violent. But under the energy released by the sun, these waves that had just risen were quickly eradicated into nothingness. In that moment, the center of the East Sea was like a void. Sea water poured in continuously, only to vaporize. Clouds gathered like rings, rapidly spreading from the sun's point of descent. Rain fell like a deluge, but at the very center, no moisture could come close. An unprecedented storm began to brew. Vast and mysterious currents formed at the sea bottom, phenomena unseen even in the remote First Era. After all, it was no longer the past, compared to 10,000 years ago. Both the sun and the ocean were far more powerful than before. And at that moment, at the bottom of the great ocean, the ancient sea god Pontus looked on with relief. Cronus. Perhaps, it doesn't matter who it is. Since you insisted on getting involved, it's a fate you've brought upon yourselves, he said. The voice was deep and distant. If it had been thousands of years earlier, the central part of the East Sea would have been the border between his and Oceanus's domains. But now, it was entirely within the other's territory. Being a sea god himself, he could guess how excruciating the pain was for the other at that moment, a pain that followed the connection of domain and godhood, piercing directly into the soul. With great power comes great responsibility. My dear nephew, your authority stems from the sea, and since you so desire to rule it, you should also be willing to bear the corresponding price, Pontus said with a cold laugh, glancing at the giant hand suppressing the sun. He shrank back toward the coast again. From the East Sea to the central continent, in territories not of the sea, he might not make it in a day, yet someone's arm had carried such a celestial body across the distance in the blink of an eye. Even with the influence of divine authority over space and time, this power was undoubted. He couldn't discern the strengths among primordial gods, nor did he know whether Cronus at this moment or the Heavenly Father at his peak was more terrifying, but he was clear that this was a force he absolutely could not resist. To suppress the sun, the owner of this power still needed one hand. But to suppress him, probably just 2 fingers would suffice. Watching this scene, Pontus made his decision in the dark. No matter who won the ultimate victory afterward, he would no longer interfere. His realm of the sea, he would leave too. His children to manage, and as for himself, like his brother, he would merge with his true form, existing eternally in the concave of the land. Beyond the sea, undoubtedly closest to this upheaval, was the vast and endless starry sky. The sun had left from there, and the energy tide stirred by that giant hand was growing more intense. On the moon, the mother goddess of light looked on with a complex expression. Besides Cronus and Helios, she was the third deity to notice the change of hands over the sun, but in just a moment, she witnessed her husband's another failure. Although Hyperion was the supreme being of light, it seemed he never succeeded. Mother goddess, just now, was the sun taken away? Asked Selene from the moon, shrinking aside. The sky had previously been ablaze with silver fire, and knowing the insider information, she was secretly happy for her friend's success. But the very next moment, nearly brushing past them, that vastly larger celestial body was plucked like fruit and casually thrust into the East Sea. She remembered the stories Hecate had told her, in which there were beings lauded as holding the sun and the moon. She had thought it was a mere anecdote, but now, the moon goddess utterly believed it, indeed, a term fitting to describe the mightiest. This made her want to run away, for who could tell if the owner of that giant hand might suddenly find it amusing to grasp both the sun and the moon together. The sun was one thing, suppressed but still stable. Even if pressed into the East Sea, constantly combating the ocean's essence, it only drained a vital essence but wasn't in danger of true disintegration. But if the moon were treated similarly? Selene thought of those god of stars whose very essence shattered, condemned to eternal slumber. She may be a true god, but her divinity is tied to the moon. Nobody knows if the divine power would still sustain her should the moon be destroyed. Fortunately, compared to a god of stars, Selene had some other tricks up her sleeve. She was now extremely grateful that she had learned some witchcraft from Hecate. After all, magic power was a form of energy, and while not as potent as divine power, it was still enough to sustain her existence for a short while. She'd already resolved that if that giant hand reached for the moon, she would flee at once to seek Hecate's assistance. Now a goddess, Hecate probably wouldn't mind taking her in as a sub-god, sharing a sliver of divine power. Chapter 137, Chapter 107 Arrogance. Yes. At the side, the Mother of Light was unaware of her daughter's thoughts. Although she heard Selene's somewhat trembling voice, Thea did not even glance at her. She simply gazed at the earth and sea, witnessing the convergence of the storm and the weakness revealed amidst the sun's fury. Previously, she knew the moon was her daughter's domain, yet she still occupied it, managing the remaining god of stars, and it's hard to say whether Thea had ever thought about the day Hyperion would break free. But now, she no longer cared about these things. Even if Hyperion had a chance to break free in the future, perhaps being a solitary sun would be better than trying to rule the starry sky. To him, Thea had fulfilled her duty. Yes, Selene, he was taken away, right before your eyes. Taking a deep breath, Thea seemed to let go of something and turned to look at her daughter. I am leaving as well, like my brother, the god of lightless celestial bodies, Kias. I will find a place of my own to live in seclusion, or maybe visit the earth and underworld that I rarely set foot upon. The moon was always meant to be yours. I've occupied it for too long. From now on, I return her to you. Your brother has his own place, and your sister probably doesn't need you to worry about her. Helios is somewhat of a god of sun, and as for Eos, the goddess of dawn, as the mother of the star gods, she will not be homeless. What? Startled, Selene didn't quite enjoy the feeling of her place being occupied by someone else, but she hadn't intended to drive Thea away. After all, as the powerful mother of light, Thea's presence was a deterrent in itself, even though she didn't really need that deterrent now. But mother, listen to me. Waving her hand to stop the moon goddess from speaking, Thea rarely looked her daughter directly in the eyes. In the past, because she was not like her eldest son, who held a part of the sun's godhood, nor like her second daughter, Yos, who was extensively social, she somewhat neglected Selene. But looking back now, perhaps she was the one who would fare the best in the future. I heard you were once friendly with a wizard named Hecate. She is the one who just became a deity, right? Yes. Selene nodded, unsure why her mother suddenly asked about her. No matter, that's good. Acquiring godhood out of nowhere, I don't know if it's what I think it is, but even if it's not, someone of equal standing must be behind her. Only they are the true masters of the world. After pondering for a moment, Thea finally admonished her daughter. I want you to remember, Selene. Unless one day you have a truly great one supporting you, never involve yourself with beings like the Divine King. In the face of absolute power, all schemes are a joke. Perhaps it was the clarity of an observer, but Thea faintly sensed that there was something wrong with that Divine King. Having personally experienced 2 changes of kingship, the Mother of Light began to understand. The seemingly glamorous throne was, in fact, not something desirable. However, no matter who was the force behind some other entity, it was now irrelevant to her. Vying for power would not help her reach that level, and without such great divine power, the authority she held was merely an illusion. Since it was an illusion, there was nothing to cling to. Light was different from the sun. She herself was not particularly keen on power. Being an ancient god who wielded light, she might be more respected than she had been when controlling part of the starry sky. The gods watching the shifting situation each reacted differently, and more than one true god chose to avoid it. And on Earth, since the day the great sun rose, countless beings had been reduced to ash and smoke in just a short time, and even within the core of the sun's fall, souls were burned to extinction. After all, souls too can die. Although they last longer than the physical body and can avoid some material damage, there is no difference in the face of the sun itself. The laws of the present world trembled faintly. Almost instantly, the aura of the divine authority of Cronus plummeted. At the same time, a sense of oppression enveloped the hearts of all deities in the present world. However, perhaps because the transition of eras had not ended, no substantial change had occurred yet. But the world's changes awaited the new king's ascension, and within Tartarus, in the twisted space-time, a 9-month-long creation was nearing its end. It's over. Is this what it feels like to control the world? At the core of the abyss, within the nascent plane, Cronus's voice came from the 9th layer of the world. As the 9 layers of the realms gradually took shape, under a certain influence, the abyss underwent miraculous changes as well. Some matter began to emerge here, but unlike worlds artificially created, because there were no deities fully belonging to the abyss yet, this change was extremely slow. Perhaps a long time would pass before these materials could come together, forming a structure akin to Earth. Maybe by that day, this place would become the first minor realm under the abyss system, linking with the 9 realms created by Cronus. The status of great divine power, even just newly opened, I have already felt a trace of that higher level power. Laine, no wonder you were always so arrogant. Though Cronus had also gained sufficient power, his control of that source power was neither smooth nor free from the consideration of the 1/3 that did not belong to him. Thus, despite taking much longer than Laine, the new world still could not compare to the nascent spirit realm. Chapter 138, Chapter 107 Arrogance _2. Fortunately, although it still appeared desolate and broken, and there was no life present, the image of the 9 realms had begun to emerge, faintly visible. The moment it was born, it greedily absorbed the power of the abyss, seizing the final moments before the birth of the mother of demons to strengthen itself. After all, losing this opportunity, it would never be so easy to draw upon the power of Tartarus again. Arrogant. So, in your eyes, that's how I've always appeared to you. Outside the 9 realms, Laine's incarnation could feel that 3/10 of his origin power had turned into the foundation of the 3rd, 5th, and 7th layers of the new world. As for Cronus, he divided his 70% of power into 6 parts, using 2 parts for the construction of the 9th layer, with the other 5 layers not differing much from each other. After all, the newly born 9 realms were unlike the spirit realm, which had a central axis running through it. Therefore, to maintain stability, Cronus decided to make the ninth layer a bit heavier. Arrogant people are often unaware of it themselves, Laine. You might not realize it, but I always feel that sense of condescendence in your heart when you look at other deities. Even Mother Earth did not seem to impress you. Outside the realms, first a white serpent shadow emerged from the 9 realms, looking very much like an enlarged version of the previous order source power. The next moment, the serpent's shadow condensed into a human form, and once again, Cronus appeared in the world as a deity. But the present him was entirely different from the past, virtually unrecognizable. Had Laine not witnessed everything that happened, he would have found it difficult to associate the thin figure with black hair and blood-red eyes before him with the former divine king. No matter how one looked at it, there was no trace of similarity between their temperaments or powers. Is that so, perhaps? But if I can't feel it, then it's also hard to talk about correcting it. After sizing up Cronus's new form, Laine spoke indifferently. It's almost time, the new realm has taken shape, and what remains is, like my spirit realm, something that must be slowly built over time. What about the divine artifact? Cronus asked. I remember you have more than one divine artifact, right? The former divine king had a fresh memory of Laine's artifacts, especially the Codex of Creation, which aligned perfectly with him when he was divine king. Now as the world master, he was reminded of how important an artifact centered around order law could be. If possible, he also planned to create one, even if it were weaker than Laine's. As for a divine artifact, I'm afraid there's not much we can do now. The order from within the abyss, like my spirituality, has become the foundation of the world and will not take the form of a divine artifact. Unlike me, you did not have additional origin invested when opening the realm, so unless you're just planning to make something of little use, there is no need at all. By contrast, the new world does still need some life. Laine shook his head slightly, clearly noticing a slight movement in Cronus's mouth. After all, the so-called additional origin included Cronus's former power of time and space, one of which was still gestating, while the other had transformed into a special mirror. Turning his gaze toward the newly born world, at this moment, it was no longer directly observable. Only a conceptual entrance in space-time was temporarily opened above the body of the mother of demons, Moya, swallowing the power converging from the abyss. Bits of origin power were being absorbed by the 9 realms, although at different rates. The 9th layer, into which Cronus poured more power, was clearly absorbing much faster than the other 8 layers, and Laine's 3 layers were faster than the remaining 5. This was the difference in practical application. After all, in absorbing and digesting source power, Laine had an eon of experience. Theoretically, creation had now ended, but the formation of the new world still required a crucial final step. Just as the great Earth needed life, this place also ought to have its own. Life was not essential for the world, but it was an indispensable part of the world's refinement. Moreover, since the souls of silver humanity had been brought here, there was obviously no need to take them back. They were originally to be used in the abyss. Laine could observe their reaction when combining with the power of the abyss, which would aid Cronus in his transformation, and even after the transformation was complete, the life that these souls turned into could serve as a contribution to his becoming the Dark Overlord of Tartarus. But now, let them become inhabitants of the new world. Perhaps some of them will be lucky enough to be promoted by Cronus to the status of quasi-gods. As for Laine's 3-tiered world, he had other plans. Cronus, these souls, consider them my congratulatory gift to you for your success. With a slight smile, feeling the vague longing emanating from the world before him, Laine mixed the souls of the silver humanity with water from the well of eternity and cast them into the new realm. In the newly born world, these souls were instantly accepted, broken down, transformed, remolded, and then granted bodies by the world to become life in another form. Maybe it was because of their connection to the abyss, but they bore no resemblance to their former selves. They looked ferocious and evil, varying in power and strength. All of a sudden, Laine seemed to discover something and Cronus did likewise. During the process of soul transformation, a strange force was revealed. It caused only a slight disturbance before being almost effortlessly swallowed and digested by the newborn realm. Because of this, the newborn 9 realms acquired a sliver of authority belonging to darkness. It seemed to be a good thing, but both sensed that in that moment, a message traveled along an invisible connection. It was the link between the origin and its master, which could be delayed by the abyss but could not be blocked. After all, its master, though not on par with the abyss, was not suppressed in terms of status. What is this situation? Darkness, is it that primordial god? There was no anger. Or rather, Cronus didn't really care if the method of opening his world was leaked or not. The abyss couldn't contain a second world. Even if the secret got out, there would be no space for others to use it. But the event was interesting. After all, it seemed that Laine hadn't noticed it beforehand either. Yes, it's Erebus and Gaia. Laine paused for a moment before slowly speaking. I had been wondering why the Dark Overlord was so quiet. Now I see. You're right, Cronus, I was a bit arrogant. Almost the instant he saw the darkness source power, Laine understood the cause and effect. Gaia had created life, and darkness itself symbolized secrecy, so even though Laine had brought these souls with him all the way, he had never actively checked them and hadn't noticed any issues. Initially, the target must have been the spirit realm, but it ended up falling into Cronus's new realm instead. It was aimed at me. I actually knew that he might not believe what I said, but I never thought he would secretly undermine me in this manner. Smuggling in with souls is indeed a good method. Gradually calming down, Laine wasn't really angry, as what the other party obtained didn't significantly harm him. On the contrary, Erebus had indeed taught him a lesson. The Dark Overlord, I can't really do anything about him now. This rarely seen primordial god truly doesn't have any flaws. Meeting Cronus's gaze, Laine shook his head, but Gaia is different. She once gave me a branch from the golden apple tree as a gift, but now I see, that gift was only superficial. These within the souls, these are the real gifts. If that's the case, then this previous gift, I must return it just as it was given. Chapter 139, Chapter 108, The Circular Courtyard. Laine's reciprocal gift obviously didn't mean to send the item back, but Cronus was still very curious about what a branch from the golden apple tree could do. However, although he asked, Laine clearly had no intention of explaining. Some things should not be given away lightly, such as the source power of space and time, and likewise, branches from the golden apple tree. To the former, the so-called giving would ultimately return to one's own hands. As for the latter, some phenomena, which seemed commonplace to her, could actually occur in many places. But that is how deities are, always subconsciously overlooking this point. However, that was a matter for the future. Now, Laine had to complete the last step. A new life has been born, and now it is my turn, he said. Before coming to the abyss, Laine had intended to retract this incarnation, but after seeing that power of order, he changed his mind. The three realms that belonged to him still needed his control for the time being. Bowing gently, in the next moment, Laine's ephemeral form as an incarnation shattered. He became the essence of chaotic source force, a capricious black mist serpent, and with a wriggle of his body, he plunged directly into the fifth realm that was his. From the outside, the snake looked very fine and ethereal. But as it neared the world, it doubled in size and became more tangible with each approach. Finally, when it entered the fifth realm, it was no longer an ethereal mist serpent but had, under the power of the realm, formed a new body just as Cronus had. The serpentine body coiled slightly, with head and tail facing each other, already encircling the world before it. Hiss. The hissing sound echoed, but in the next moment, the world understood its meaning. This was its master naming it. Henceforth, the fifth realm had its own unique name, Central Court. Central Court is a good name, a divine court situated in the central world. It seems I too should give my world a fittingly illustrative name, Cronus mused. Feeling the power tapping lightly on the realm's barrier, Laine opened the gateway, and thus a figure appeared. The new lord of the 9 realms stood before him. Have you thought of one? The giant serpent raised its head, its eyes large as stars, and looked at Cronus. I have. This is a place beneath the earth, even below the underworld, thus. It should include hell. It was once a prison for criminals, a place not embraced by the present world, thus it could be called a dungeon. Since that is so, let's call it hell. Hell has 9 levels. Since I cannot be the king of the abyss, being the lord of the 9 hells isn't too bad either. For millennia, Cronus had never felt as happy and relaxed as he did at this moment. But perhaps now, he could no longer be called Cronus. After all, everything associated with the old gods had been washed away, and he was now a newly born deity. Thus, he raised his head. With the authority of the Lord of the 9 hells he looked out upon the new life within the 9 realms, proclaiming the declaration of the world. Come forth and behold your master, you sinful beings. I am the Lord of the 9 hells, Asmodeus. Time-space passageways linked the 9 realms, and his voice reverberated through the realms. No matter what emotions they harbored, As they felt the power from the world itself, the newly born beings stepped into the passageway, heading to the fifth realm where the world lord was currently. But when they arrived at Central Court, the first thing they saw was not the hellish lord who had called them, but rather the giant serpent encircling the world. With head and tail touching, circling the world, the serpent's eyes were like two great suns, overlooking the lives that had just arrived in Central Court. Centuries later, the devils recorded that day as follows. In the very beginning, the child of chaos tore the abyss apart. He fashioned order out of the void, creating a home for the devils. Henceforth, Tartarus became their eternal foe. An unending war played out between them, for they were of the same essence and could unite as one. In the dark nine hells, devils are the world's favored children, the order in chaos, the civilization amidst corruption. All this stemmed from the grace of the monarch of hell. No devil dared to challenge the sovereign's majesty, all but he himself. He is the serpent of the garden, the earthly python that devours all spirits, the monarch of hell who co-rules the nine hells with Asmodeus. Outside, Underworld. Shortly after the souls of silver humanity had been transformed, the Underworld, which had remained stable for tens of thousands of years, suddenly quivered. Finally, sensing the information that came through, although those origins had been devoured by the New World, the Dark Overlord did not care in the slightest. Compared to that loss, he was far more concerned with the harvest he had long awaited. He examined the content within the information bit by bit. Though it was somewhat vague due to Tartarus's interference, it was still enough to let him see the most crucial part. What constitutes a world, and what kind of existence can create it? So that's how it is. The prerequisite for opening a world is to strip away all of one's past self, and then use a power that is beyond the control of the current world as the foundation. Yes, the initial foundation of the present world was Gaia. It was after her that the sky, the oceans, and even further differentiation into the stars and the underworld came into being. The reason Laine was able to transcend was probably because he was born early enough and was weak enough, so he easily washed away the present world's influence on him, then used the power that belonged to him before Gaia's birth to open the spirit realm. His expression was somewhat surprised. Although there were still some things he didn't understand, such as the methods Laine and Cronus used to cleanse themselves of the traces of the present world, and why, when both were creating worlds, Laine's spirit realm triggered Chaos's wanted notice. While Cronus, Asmodeus's hell did not, that no longer mattered. Perhaps the first must suffer some hardships, but subsequent beings will have it easier. In any case, the process was already complete. The key issue now was how to complete the first step. Strictly speaking, the realm of lightlessness and the land of eternal night, although heavily influenced by the present world, are not entirely under its control, but at the same time, they are far from being an assembly of chaos like the abyss, entirely independent of the present world. They are influenced by both, just that the side of order has a deeper effect, so calling the realm of lightlessness the outworld isn't really a problem. Therefore, under such circumstances, the twin gods of the dark night maintain neither the essence of the completely chaotic abyss nor the fully personified character of Gaia, which is entirely orderly. The previous time Laine entered the land of eternal night, he discovered life influenced by chaotic forces within it for the very same reason. Thus, for Erebus, a power outside the present world is actually quite easy to obtain since he possesses it himself. In the realm of lightlessness, remnants from the dawn of creation are scattered throughout, and he had never cared for them before. Although these powers were weak, as long as they could open a world, Erebus could completely swallow his old body with the new world. His own essence would not resist himself. Once done, this would not only not affect his power, but it would also free him from the shackles of the present world. By then, the reborn realm of lightlessness, like the abyss, would become one of the main entities of the other side of chaos, but he would maintain his own consciousness. Moreover, Erebus had even contemplated a further direction. He planned to bring every place outside the present world under his control, with the abyss among his targets. If he could be successful, then he would become another sovereign of chaos, a being equal in stature to the will of the present world. After all, the will of the present world is the only existence he could see that was half a step higher than the great divine power. So how do I complete the first step? Stripping away everything of myself. With my magnitude, it will be countless times more difficult than them. Frowning slightly, although the idea was good, taking the first step to start everything, to cleanse the past, turned out to be the Dark Overlord's most difficult task. Without even thinking, one could tell that the difficulty of shedding all of the great divine power is not comparable to shedding the power of the former divine king, and even Laine himself might not have the ability to do it. Even if he had the ability, Erebus had not been pushed to the edge of the cliff like Cronus. Why would he pay such a heavy price and pin his hopes on an enemy that had just been established? And for other methods, Erebus really couldn't think of any at the moment. Forget it, I'll think about these matters later. For now, it's time I took action. The gods of the present world are not a concern, but if I can cause him more trouble, that's good, too. Raising his gaze toward the land, Erebus was well aware that by now, Laine had probably sensed his cover move and would know of his small actions. So from this moment on, they were enemies. Since they were enemies, then whatever the other side wanted to do, he had to oppose, whatever the other side opposed, he had to support. Of course, distinguishing whether the other side's attitude was genuine rather than being deceived by appearances was the time to test both parties' wisdom. Come, let me witness the power of the Lord of the Spirit Realm. With a thought, the realm of lightlessness expanded. Almost instantly, it crossed the boundary delineated by the light of the nether moon, traversing the division between the present world and the outworld. In this moment, the Dark Overlord clearly felt the present world's law's subtle resistance against him, but he was unconcerned. Just this once, the price was nothing to worry about. Chapter 140, Chapter 109 Apology. Unlike Gaia, Erebus was very clear on how to target his opponent as much as possible while avoiding destruction to the world. What use was there in fighting him, when piercing through that layer of skin he was clothed in could truly threaten him? At that time, one side would be Earth's incarnation, targeted but at least one of their own, and the other side would be the uncontrollable, destructive outsider. It was glaringly obvious where the present world's instinct would stand. Thus, darkness surged from the fissures of the earth. At first, it was a mere trickle, but in the span of a breath, it became immeasurable. Twisting and flowing, it reached out towards the towering figure standing upon the earth, as if to envelop the great deity within. As long as he could make contact, Erebus could use his authority to unveil the secrets hidden beneath and expose them before the present world and the gods. However, Laine couldn't possibly be unprepared for this, for as the sovereign of spirituality, his thoughts were synchronized with his incarnation. Thus, the very next moment, an ephemeral barrier likewise emerged, staunchly blocking the path of the darkness. There was no sound, no vision, and even beings below great divine power had yet to notice as the two domains collided in silence. The present world shook, waves stirred in the source sea, and slight tremors occurred in both colliding domains, yet nothing was aware of this. Everything happened without sound nor notice, yet it gestated surging waves of terror. What a nuisance. In a low murmur within his heart, at this moment, Laine finally felt the pressure, the oppressiveness of a true primordial god. There was no probing. The first strike was made with full force. The Dark Overlord's goal was not to dispose of him. Laine could sense that. The adversary was targeting the nearly non-existent Divine King's power that now surrounded him. So, if he didn't wish to be unmasked, his options were to counter with equal force or to choose an end. The former he was doing, but sensing the nearly instant, tiny cracks that surrounded him, Laine knew he was still somewhat behind Erebus. Let's end it here, it's almost done anyway. Looking towards Zeus in the distance, his beloved son, and then at his nearly exhausted Divine King's power, Laine finally decided to retreat. At present, he seemed at ease, one hand suppressing the earth, the other capturing the great sun, even briefly contending against an aggressively approaching primordial god, but only he knew the tremendous pressure he faced. The first two were manageable. With his current powerful divine status, although lacking in strength, his essence was far superior to Gaia by an indeterminate degree. A fraction of divine power was more than enough to surpass her by tenfold, hence his advantage over Mother Earth was as expected, but Erebus was different. This primordial god was in prime condition, his essence intact, even fully rallying his body's power in total commitment. Laine's ability to contend with him actually relied on the spirit realm itself for balance. But he was not yet the great divine power, and such actions, manipulating forces of a complete world from beyond its borders, placed severe oppression on his divine body. As personified incarnations, Gaia and Erebus would endure likewise, but their stronger divine force naturally meant they were less affected. This oppression's harm wasn't a problem in the short term, but the longer it lasted, the more serious it became, and his divine body would collapse ever more rapidly. Eventually, it could even lead to an uncontrollable avalanche. Though for Laine, the collapse of his divine body wasn't fatal. Recovery would be difficult in the immediate future, and this would inevitably affect the final arrangements of this era. The main objective of his mission was nearly accomplished, with only the conclusion left. Instead of wasting more time here, it was better to stop. Let's end this era now, he decided. Having made up his mind, Laine no longer hesitated. With a light command, an invisible force over the East Sea took hold of the great sun. Come. In the next moment, under his power, the ancient god of sun was effortlessly taken by the force of space-time and disappeared into the void with a fluctuation. He had already warned Hyperion, if he dared to trouble him again, Laine would not spare him. Although in Hyperion's eyes, he was only attacking Cronus, the outcome would be no different. Luck is also a part of strength, and in the chaos world, fate and karma are real. Perhaps in a way, the fate of the Titan god's downfall was meant to be here. For such an inconsequential fate, Laine was happy to go with the flow. With the god of sun captured, there was no longer a need to maintain pressure on the sun. His power could be withdrawn, and so the generation of cracks on his divine body slowed. In the east, the unshackled sun finally trembled as it rose back into the sky, bursting through the clouds to return to the firmament. Yet, the influence it brought continued to ferment. In a mere half-hour, the waters of the East Sea had dropped by 1/3. The thick clouds centered around the sun's previous descent covered half the ocean. Endless waters surged from the other 3 directions towards the east. Laine could already foresee that for a considerably long period to come, the climate of the present world would become terribly harsh. Tsunamis tens of thousands of meters high, incessant earthquakes and volcanoes, overflowing floods, decades of unending rainstorms. Some of these effects might even permanently harden into the world, forming insurmountable desolation for future mortals. And at the center of the East Sea, the immense vortex still existed, permanently altering the laws of a place, shaking the current climate, and even the collision of celestial bodies, the collapse of the Mount of the Gods. Doing all these should be about enough. Withdrawing his gaze, Laine could feel the increasingly severe rejection of the present world. It was not just against himself, but also against Gaia and the other gods who had caused all this. After all, up to this point, Gaia was still supporting it with all her might. Beneath the clash of powers between the 2 ancient gods, the Earth's crust was trembling, and the tectonic plates were shifting. New mountains rose while old ones buckled. Unlike the other deities, Gaia had probably sensed the collision between the spirit realm and the realm of lightlessness, so her actions were even more intense, but she would still not know who was behind all of this. Laine had no desire to clear up her confusion. The moment he noticed the issue with the souls of silver humanity, he was prepared. Who said this affair had to be orchestrated by him? Couldn't it be that Erebus was probing the world's possibilities and secretly using Cronus as a scout? After all, the real Cronus no longer existed, and even the newly born Lord of the 9 Hells could now only be regarded as a new god with the memories of the former divine king. In truth, the ruined tapestry had more claim to the name of Cronus than Asmodeus did. Shaking his head slightly, in the next moment, Laine withdrew his power and the omnipresent illusion slowly dissipated. In the gaze of the gods, the figure of Cronus slowly emerged. But it was almost visibly apparent that the divine king's body was rapidly losing power, and even his body seemed somewhat ethereal. However, this time, although the gods had various thoughts, no one dared to approach any longer. Just moments ago, the god of the ocean, Oceanus, had passed out amidst painful screams, a sound that still lingered in their ears. In the previous era, Uranus would have considered it a pleasant accompaniment, but to the current gods, it sounded like a death knell. Deities do not die, but they can be tormented, so no matter the condition of Cronus now, they would not be the first to act. After all, no god would be deceived by the same existence 3 times in one day. And perhaps because the divine body was carrying the power of the spirit realm, although the divine power surrounding Cronus was now almost imperceptible, and his divine body was gradually deteriorating, an intangible oppression was growing even more intense. In the eyes of the gods, the current divine king felt to them eerily similar to the will of the present world. Combined with his now ethereal form, an unfounded conjecture appeared in the minds of a few deities. Could it be that, in seeking to become the great divine power, an accident occurred and now he is about to merge with the world? If interpreted this way, then the previous inconsistencies seemed to have an explanation. The power of the divine king was indeed waning, but his combat strength became more fearsome, although it is likely he did not succeed. Otherwise, the first post-creation great divine power in the chaos world would not be so quiet. This also seemed to fit with fate. If pure power couldn't defeat him, then let him defeat himself. Your Majesty. In the eerily tense scene, Zeus's eyes were shifting, and the other deities each had their own thoughts. But as Cronus was about to speak, suddenly, a blue-haired, graceful goddess fell to her knees beside Zeus. The divine king recognized her. It was Eurybia, daughter of the ancient sea god Pontus and wife of the god of meteorology, Creus, symbolizing one aspect of the power of the sea. As the wife of the god of meteorology, Eurybia should have stood by the divine king. But clearly, facing the overwhelming situation before and the fates of legend, this goddess chose easily. She betrayed the divine king, stood on the side of Olympus, and then regretted her decision fervently upon witnessing Cronus's hidden true power. Your Majesty, I plead for your forgiveness for my earlier foolish actions. It was Zeus's wife, the cunning Metis, who deceived me. I am willing to accept your punishment, but I beseech you to forgive my previous sin, for the sake of my husband's honor. Eurybia's voice was somewhat sharp, her appearance a bit disheveled, but inside, many deities actually wanted to take her place. If possible, they, too, would want to kneel before the divine king and beg for mercy, but unlike Eurybia, who had some relation to Cronus, they couldn't even find a reason to justify themselves. But there were also some gods whose expressions remained unchanged on the surface, yet their thoughts were inscrutable. If things were indeed as they suspected, then perhaps this time, Eurybia had acted prematurely again. Once the divine king is replaced, due to her actions today, even in the future divine court, the lineage of the ancient sea god would inevitably face exclusion. But that did not concern them, and no one would speak out, not even Eurybia's brother and Pontus's eldest son, Thalassa, the personification of sea's gentleness, Nereus. Conjecture, after all, is just conjecture. Before the laws of the present world shifted with the change of the divine king, he dared not act precipitately. After all, the dreadful state of the god of the ocean was not too long ago.